you already know what you should do. That's the part nobody talks about. You have the plan, you've had it for months. You know you should wake up earlier, work on the thing that matters, stop scrolling at midnight. You've written it down. You've felt the clarity of a fresh Monday morning. And then, somehow, by Wednesday you're back to the same patterns, making the same quiet promises to yourself that tomorrow will be different. This book is not going to tell you to try harder. Trying harder is what you've already been doing. What you actually need is a blueprint, a system built on how your brain works, not how you wish it worked. Stay with me. Introduction. The blueprint exists. Picture someone you know, maybe it's you, who is genuinely smart, genuinely capable, who has read the books and watched the videos and highlighted the passages and felt, in those moments, the particular clarity of someone who finally gets it. This person knows, with real specificity, what they should be doing. They know they should exercise in the morning before the day swallows them whole. They know they should be working on their creative project, their business idea, their long-neglected health. They know the difference between what matters and what merely feels urgent. They know all of it. The gap in their life is not informational. And still, most days, the knowing doesn't translate into doing. This gap, the space between understanding and action, between intention and follow-through, between the person you know you're capable of being and the person you're actually being right now, is one of the most demoralizing places a human being can inhabit. It's not ignorance. It's not a lack of intelligence or ambition or desire. It is something far more specific and far more solvable than any of those things. It is a missing system. A missing blueprint. And the disorienting thing about missing a blueprint is that you can work extremely hard, put in genuine effort, care deeply about the outcome, and still make almost no progress, because the effort isn't organized around the right structure. This is not a character problem. It never was. What this book is not a motivation book. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings are unreliable narrators. You've noticed this already. You've had moments of brilliant, electric motivation, mornings when everything felt possible, when the goal was sharp and the path was clear and you felt genuinely, almost physically propelled toward it. And you've watched that feeling dissolve before Tuesday was over, for no particular reason, without any specific triggering event, just gone. If motivation were the answer, you'd have solved this already, because you've felt motivated plenty of times. The problem is that motivation doesn't last, and discipline built on motivation is discipline that collapses the moment the feeling disappears. This is also not a quick fix book. There is no 7-second morning ritual that will rewire your entire life. There is no single habit that will cascade into total transformation before the month is out, no cold shower practice that will unlock a new identity, no journaling prompt that will restructure your neurology. Anyone promising that is selling you something that won't hold. The discipline you've tried to build on those foundations hasn't held either, which is probably part of why you're here. This is not a book that will tell you to try harder. Trying harder is almost certainly something you've been doing, and the fact that you're reading this book suggests that trying harder, by itself, is not sufficient. The deficiency is not in your effort. It is in your architecture. You've been building without the right structure, and no amount of effort applied to a structurally flawed design produces a structurally sound result. This is not a book that will shame you or that will ask you to beat yourself up about the pattern you're stuck in. The pattern has causes that are well understood, neurologically and psychologically, and most of those causes are not about you as a person. They are about the mismatch between the brain you have, a brain that evolved for a world radically different from the one you currently live in, and the environment you're operating in. Understanding that mismatch clearly is the first step toward designing around it. What this book is, specifically, is a system. It's built on neuroscience, on behavioral psychology, on the consistent findings of researchers who have spent careers understanding why human beings act and fail to act the way they do. It's built on the honest, unglamorous reality of what it takes to do the hard thing repeatedly. When nothing external is compelling you to do it. Discipline, properly understood, is not a personality trait. It is not something some people have and others are born without, some innate quality of character distributed unevenly at birth. It is a skill, learnable, trainable, buildable from wherever you are right now, including from the lowest point of repeated failure and disappointed intention. The research on this is unambiguous. The people who appear most effortlessly disciplined are not, by and large, people with superior willpower or tougher character. They are people who have successfully automated more of their important behaviors, who have designed their environments in ways that make the right choices easier, who have organized their lives so that the question of whether to do the important thing rarely comes up. They are not fighting themselves every morning. They built systems that make the fight mostly unnecessary. This book will show you how to build those systems. Not in the abstract, not in the motivational sense, but in the specific, practical, evidence-based sense of, here is what the system looks like, here is why each element works, here is how you know which version of the system is appropriate for where you currently are, and here is exactly what to do when it inevitably gets hard. The 3 parts the book moves through 3 distinct parts, and each one does a specific, indispensable job. The first part, which runs through chapters 1 and 2, is about understanding. Before you can build a system, you need to understand why the current one keeps failing. Most people who struggle with discipline don't understand their own brains very well, not because they're unintelligent, but because the popular narrative about discipline is mostly wrong. Chapter 1 addresses what discipline actually is at the neurological level, because the correct understanding changes everything about how you approach building it. Chapter 2 addresses why your brain resists the evolutionary, neurochemical, and environmental forces that make consistent disciplined behavior genuinely difficult, and why willpower alone is not equipped to defeat them. These chapters go into the actual neuroscience in a way that makes your own behavior suddenly legible. When you understand why your brain fights you on this, you stop taking it personally. And when you stop taking it personally, you can start solving the actual problem. The second part, chapters 3 through 6, is about diagnosing your specific pattern. Not everyone fails at discipline for the same reason, and this matters more than most generic discipline advice acknowledges. Chapter 3 walks you through 4 profiles of discipline failure: the starter, the perfectionist, the reactor, and the avoider, and helps you identify which pattern is predominantly yours through a self-scoring audit. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 explore the 3 most significant dimensions of discipline failure in depth: the consistency problem, the motivation trap, and the way discipline failures show up in your relationships. The diagnostic work in this section is some of the most important in the book, because the reset protocols in Part 3 work not because they're generically good systems, but because they're designed to address specific patterns. Knowing your pattern is the difference between a protocol that works and one that doesn't. The third part, chapters 7 through 10, is the action section. It contains 3-tiered reset protocols: a 7-day beginner reset, a 21-day intermediate system, and a 30-day identity overhaul, plus a final chapter on sustaining what you build over the long term. You'll know which level is yours after Part 2. The protocols are detailed, day by day in some cases, with tracking tables, slip protocols, and weekly review tools built directly in. These are not motivation challenges or streak games. They are systems designed to function even on the days when you don't want to do any of it, designed, specifically, for the real human reality of motivation decay, competing demands, and irregular days. The problem with knowing before we move into Chapter 1, there's one more thing worth naming directly, because it's something this particular kind of book is susceptible to: the substitution of knowledge for action. There is a particular kind of reader who finishes the introduction of a book like this feeling genuinely good, as if the knowledge alone constitutes a kind of progress. They highlight passages. They dog-ear pages. They feel, briefly, like they've already changed, like the understanding they've just acquired is a version of the outcome. And then the book goes on the shelf, and nothing moves. The insight was real, but insight, without action, is decoration. This is worth naming because you might be tempted to do this, and it won't help you. The understanding in chapters 1 and 2 is useful and important, but it only matters if it changes what you do. The diagnostic work in chapters 3 through 6 is genuinely illuminating, but it only matters if you take the audits seriously and carry the results into Part 3. The protocols in chapters 7 through 9 are effective and well designed, but they only work if you actually start one and actually do it, on the actual day after you finish reading, not in some improved future version of your schedule. This is the central discipline challenge of reading a discipline book. The same pattern that makes discipline difficult, the gap between knowing and doing, can express itself in the very act of engaging with material about that gap. Be aware of this. The preparation is not the thing. The reading is not the thing. The thing is the thing, which begins in part 3 and continues for as long as you maintain it. Finish the book. Do the reflections at the end of each chapter in writing, which makes the reflection more cognitively durable and more honest than merely thinking through the questions. Identify which reset protocol is yours and start it the day after you finish reading. Not someday. The day after. The research behind the blueprint this book draws on a body of research that has been building for decades, and it is worth briefly orienting you to the science that informs it, not because the research matters more than your practical experience, but because understanding where these ideas come from changes how you hold them. The neurological foundation comes primarily from the work of unbreakable at MIT, whose decades of research on the basal ganglia and habit formation revealed the mechanism of behavioral automaticity, the process by which repeated behaviors transfer from effortful conscious control to efficient automatic execution. This research tells us what discipline actually is at the biological level, and it is the reason this book does not ask you to become a more willful person. The research on willpower and self-control draws heavily on Roy Baumeister's work on ego depletion, the documented phenomenon of self-regulation degrading under conditions of extended use, as well as on Wilhelm Hoffman and his colleagues' work showing that high self-control individuals succeed not primarily through superior willpower but through superior environmental design. Together, these bodies of work explain why willpower only approaches fail and what actually works instead. The habit research of Charles Duhigg's synthesis of the cue routine reward loop, and Filippo Lalli's empirical work on how long habit formation actually takes, establishes the timeline and mechanism of behavioral change in a way that prevents the single most common mistake people make, expecting transformation before the neurological foundation has had time to build. Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions, Peter Lewinson's foundational work on behavioral activation, Albert Bandura's decades of self-efficacy research, and the procrastination scholarship of Timothy Pychyl and Fuchsia Surois all inform specific chapters directly and inform the overall architecture of the 3 reset protocols. None of this is cited in the style of an academic paper, because this is not an academic paper. It is a practical guide. But the practical guidance is rooted in real research done by real people, and you should know that because it means you're not working with someone's opinion about what might help. You're working with tested, replicated understanding of how human behavior actually changes. A word about where you are before the book begins properly. There is something worth saying to the person who is reading this from a place of real discouragement, the person who has tried before, multiple times, and has a history with themselves of starting and stopping that makes the optimism at the beginning of anything like this feel faintly foolish. You know what it's like to be excited about a new system, to feel genuinely different this time, and to watch it fade into the same pattern. You've been here before. Maybe many times. If that's you, this book does not ask you to be optimistic. Optimism is a feeling, and feelings are not what makes systems work. What this book asks is far more modest: that you read it honestly, do the diagnostic work in part 2, choose the appropriate protocol in part 3, and start it on the day after you finish. Not with enthusiasm. You may not have enthusiasm available, and enthusiasm is not required. With willingness. With the small, specific act of beginning. The history of previous attempts is not predictive evidence about this attempt. It is evidence about what hasn't worked, which is genuinely useful information about what to do differently. The failed attempts are not baggage. They are data. This book is designed to help you read that data clearly. A genuine encouragement. None of this is meant to be daunting, and it's worth ending the introduction on an honest note of encouragement that isn't merely motivational. Here is what the evidence actually shows. Across decades of research on behavior change and habit formation, people who have failed repeatedly at building discipline are not more likely to fail in the future because of their history of failure. The history is not destiny. What predicts future success is not the track record but the presence of an accurate understanding of the failure pattern and a system designed to address it directly. You now have the beginning of that understanding. By the time you finish this book, you'll have the full diagnosis and the full system. The research is clear on another point that is easy to miss but deeply important. The most significant predictor of long-term behavior change is not the initial effort applied to the change but the quality of the system that supports it. People with excellent systems and average willpower consistently outperform people with poor systems and exceptional willpower. You do not need to be exceptional. You need a good system. That is what this book is. the blueprint exists. The problem you've been having is not that you're too broken for it to work. The problem is that you've been building without it. Let's change that now. Practical reflection. Take 5 minutes before moving to Chapter 1. Answer these questions in writing, even in the Notes app on your phone is fine, as long as you actually write rather than just think. When was the last time you had a clear intention to do something important and didn't follow through? Describe the specific situation and the specific gap. What story did you tell yourself afterward about why it didn't happen? Be honest, not the reasonable version you'd tell someone else, but the actual internal narrative. What is the version of your life you most clearly imagine when you think about having reliable discipline? What specifically changes? What becomes possible that currently isn't? Don't skip this. The questions are simple. The answers will matter more than they currently feel like they should. Chapter 1: What Discipline Actually Is. In 2006, a researcher named unbreakable at MIT published findings from a decade of work studying rats navigating mazes. When the rats first encountered a new maze, their brains were intensely active, the prefrontal cortex firing constantly as they made decisions at every turn, processing information, evaluating options, choosing direction. But something strange happened over time. The more the rats ran the same maze, the quieter their brains became. Not because they were confused or disengaged, their performance was actually improving, their maze times getting faster, their navigation more precise, but because the behavior had transferred. What had begun as conscious decision-making was gradually becoming something else entirely. The brain was handing the maze over to a different system, one that operated below conscious awareness, one that could run the route efficiently without demanding the brain's full attention at every step. By the time the rats were expert maze runners, the thinking part of their brains barely stirred. The behavior had been absorbed. This is one of the most important things neuroscience has discovered about human behavior in the past 30 years. And it is almost exactly the opposite of what most people believe discipline is. The popular misconception: most people, when they think about discipline, picture something effortful. They picture someone forcing themselves out of bed at 5 in the morning through sheer force of will, white-knuckling through a workout they hate, grinding through hours of work on something that feels unrewarding because that is what the disciplined person does. In this popular image, discipline is constant exertion. It is the heroic, ongoing resistance of comfort. It is, above all, hard, and the hardness is the point, the evidence that you're doing it right, the sign that you're tougher than the part of you that wants to quit. This image is not just wrong, it is actively harmful, because it makes discipline seem like a form of sustained suffering that only certain constitutionally special people can maintain indefinitely. If you believe discipline means constant effortful struggle, then every day that feels easy is suspicious, perhaps evidence that you're not doing enough, and every day that feels hard is evidence that you're working appropriately. You are always either fighting your nature or proving how strong you are. Neither is a sustainable relationship with your own behavior, and neither, it turns out, is how discipline actually functions in the people who have it most deeply established. The real insight from Grable's research and from decades of subsequent work on habit formation, automaticity, and behavioral consistency is that genuine discipline, once built, doesn't feel like discipline at all. It feels like nothing. It feels like Tuesday morning, like the thing you do before the day starts, like the behavior that happens so reliably and with so little friction that the question of whether to do it barely registers as a question. The person who appears most impressively disciplined from the outside is often, from the inside, the person who has least experience of the grinding effort we typically associate with discipline. They've built something that has moved past effort into something closer to architecture. What the brain is actually doing to understand this properly, you need to spend some time with two brain systems that are in constant, dynamic conversation, systems that most people interact with every day of their lives without ever knowing them by name. The prefrontal cortex is located just behind your forehead, and it is the seat of conscious reasoning, deliberate decision-making, planning, and what researchers call executive function, the capacity to regulate behavior in service of chosen goals. When you're weighing whether to work on your project or scroll social media, that deliberation is happening in the prefrontal cortex. When you're trying to resist a craving, override an impulse, or stick to a commitment you made to yourself in a calmer moment, the prefrontal cortex is doing the heavy lifting. It is the brain's most sophisticated system, capable of extraordinary things: abstract thought, long-term planning, counterfactual reasoning, the consideration of other people's perspectives. But it is also metabolically expensive, cognitively limited, and fatigable. It burns glucose, it tires across the course of a day, and it has a finite daily budget for the kind of effortful conscious reasoning it is capable of. Ask it to do too much, and it degrades. This is a hard constraint, not a character flaw. The basal ganglia is a very different structure, much older evolutionarily, buried deep in the brain's subcortical regions, and operating by entirely different principles. Where the prefrontal cortex deliberates, the basal ganglia executes. Where the prefrontal cortex weighs options, the basal ganglia runs patterns. The basal ganglia is the brain's habit storage and pattern execution system. It takes sequences of behavior that have been repeated in consistent conditions often enough and compresses them into efficient, automatic routines that can be triggered by a contextual cue and run off without drawing on the prefrontal cortex's limited resources at all. This is the mechanism behind Graybeel's maze rats. When a new behavior is learned, the prefrontal cortex does the work. When that behavior is repeated enough times in consistent enough conditions, the basal ganglia takes over. The behavior becomes, in the neurological sense, automatic, triggerable by the right cue, executable with minimal conscious involvement, resistant to interruption by fatigue or distraction or competing demands. The thinking has already been done. The behavior simply runs. This transfer is not a failure of engagement or a sign of diminished caring. It is one of the brain's most elegant and useful adaptations. By handing repeated behaviors off to the basal ganglia, the brain frees the prefrontal cortex to engage with novelty, solve new problems, handle the unexpected, and do the kind of high-level reasoning that genuinely requires its capabilities. Every behavior that gets compressed into a basal ganglia routine creates more cognitive capacity for things that actually need conscious attention. Your brain is not becoming less involved when behaviors become automatic. It is becoming more strategically deployed. The habit loop, the mechanism through which the basal ganglia organizes and stores behavioral routines, was synthesized most accessibly by Charles Duhigg, drawing on the neurological work of Graybeel and others, as a three-part structure: cue, routine, reward. Every automatic behavior in your life, every true habit, whether useful or not, operates through this loop. The cue is a trigger, something in the environment or your internal state that activates the routine. It might be a time of day, a physical location, an emotional state, a specific person's presence, or a preceding behavior in an established sequence. The cue is the on switch, the input that initiates the pattern. The routine is the behavior itself, the specific sequence of actions that unfolds following the cue. Once the cue activates the loop, the routine runs. This is why habits are hard to stop mid-execution. Once the cue is fired, momentum builds rapidly. The reward is the neurochemical signal that follows the routine's completion, typically a release of dopamine, or a reduction of an aversive state, that tells the brain's learning systems this sequence is worth storing and repeating. The reward is what makes the loop self-reinforcing. The more times cue routine reward plays out successfully, the more entrenched the basal ganglia's representation of the pattern becomes, and the more automatically it executes the next time the cue appears. Every automatic behavior in your life follows this structure, from the reach for your phone when you're bored, boredom cue, phone checking routine, stimulation and distraction reward, to brushing your teeth before bed, bedtime cue, dental hygiene routine, clean mouth sensation reward, to the morning coffee ritual that happens before you've fully processed that you want coffee. The loops are running constantly, reliably, and with very little conscious supervision. The practical implication of this for building discipline is significant. If you want a disciplined behavior to become automatic, you are not simply trying to become stronger or more willful. You are trying to engineer a loop, to identify and establish a reliable cue, to execute the behavior consistently in the presence of that cue, and to ensure that there is enough of a reward signal, or completion sensation, or sense of forward progress, to reinforce the pattern. You are, in this sense, a habit engineer rather than a discipline warrior. The job is design, not conquest. Discipline is not a character trait. One of the most damaging and most persistent beliefs about discipline is that it is an innate characteristic, that some people simply have it and others don't, that it is a personality feature as fundamental and as fixed as height or eye color. This belief is particularly harmful because it converts every failure at discipline into evidence of a fundamental personal inadequacy. If discipline is a trait you either have or you don't, then struggling with it means you're the kind of person who lacks discipline, and that identity is self-fulfilling. It not only explains past failures but predicts future ones. The neuroscience does not support this. What research consistently demonstrates is that people who appear highly disciplined are not, in general, people who possess superior willpower or more robust executive function. They are people who have successfully automated more of their most important behaviors. The critical study here was published in the journal Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin by Wilhelm Hoffman and his colleagues. They found that high self-control individuals actually reported experiencing fewer temptations than low self-control individuals, not because they were better at resisting temptation, but because they had structured their lives, largely without explicit awareness of doing so, in ways that reduced the frequency and intensity of tempting situations. They weren't fighting harder or more successfully. They were needing to fight far less, because the situations that require fighting had been designed out of their daily experience. This reframes the project of building discipline completely. You are not trying to become a different kind of person, not trying to develop an innate capacity you currently lack, not trying to override a temperament that doesn't suit the demands of your goals. You are trying to build systems, environmental, behavioral, social, temporal, that make your most important actions easier and more automatic. The behavioral change comes first. The identity that matches the behavior follows. Not the other way around. The character you want to have is built through the repetition of the behavior you want to have, until that behavior has transferred from something you decide to do into something you simply do. That transfer takes time. It takes consistent repetition in consistent conditions. But it does not require a different person. It requires a better designed set of conditions for the person you already are. Reduced decision-making load. There is one more dimension to what discipline actually is that deserves explicit attention here: the relationship between discipline and the number of decisions you have to make. Every deliberate decision you make over the course of a day draws from a finite pool of cognitive and motivational resources. This is not a popular psychology myth. Research by Jonathan Lebov at Stanford and Shai Danziger at Ben-Gurion University demonstrated this in a study that has become one of the most cited findings in behavioral economics. Israeli parole board judges were significantly more likely to grant parole at the beginning of the day and after breaks than later in sessions, after many decisions had been made. The effect was substantial, far more substantial than any conscious factor the judges would have identified as relevant. The quality of their reasoning had degraded, not because of fatigue in the ordinary sense, but because the raw material of decision-making had been progressively depleted by the decisions already made that day. For you, this means that every morning when you have to decide whether to do your important work, to exercise, to write, to work on the project, to do the difficult but necessary thing, you are burning from a limited daily budget. The decision itself, regardless of what you decide, costs you something. And by the time you've fielded your inbox, navigated your commute, handled the first wave of work demands, and made hundreds of small to medium decisions, the resource is significantly lower than it was when you woke up. By evening, when many people's most important personal commitments tend to get postponed, the budget is at its daily nadir. True discipline removes the decision wherever possible. The disciplined person has already decided, at the system level, in a calmer and more resource-rich moment, what will happen every morning before the day begins. The workout happens at 6 because it always happens at 6, not because there's a fresh decision made every morning, but because the decision was made once and the behavior simply executes within the established structure. The writing happens before email because that's the rule, not a daily negotiation between competing impulses. This is what makes some people look effortlessly consistent, not that they are exerting superhuman effort, but that they've engineered their lives so that the most important behaviors require as little effortful decision-making as possible. They've moved those behaviors out of the daily deliberation economy and into automatic execution. The effort was spent on the design. The behavior runs on the design's momentum. What this means for you if discipline is not willpower, not an innate trait, not the heroic ongoing suppression of everything that makes you human, if it is, instead, the successful automation of important behaviors through well-designed habits, established cues, and reduced decision-making load, then building it becomes a very different kind of project than most people imagine. It means you don't need to become a different person. You need to become a better engineer of your own environment and habits. It means the days when discipline feels easy are not suspicious, they are the goal. The absence of struggle is the evidence of the system working. The presence of struggle is evidence that the system still needs work, not that you're sufficiently devoted. It means that failures at discipline are not character indictments. They are design failures. They reveal a place in the system where a cue is weak, where decision-making is being left to the moment when resources are depleted, where the reward signal is insufficient to reinforce the pattern. These are specific, identifiable, fixable problems. The solution is design adjustment, not self-punishment. It means the path forward is clear. Understand the specific pattern of your discipline failure, choose the system that addresses that pattern directly, and execute it consistently enough and long enough that the most important behaviors begin to transfer from the prefrontal cortex's effortful management to the basal ganglia's automatic execution. That transfer is what all of Part 3 is designed to facilitate. This is the foundation. Everything else in this book is built on it. Practical reflection. Take 10 minutes with these questions. Writing them down in a notebook, a document, anywhere physical or digital, makes the reflection more cognitively durable than simply thinking through the answers. Think of 3 behaviors in your current life that feel completely automatic, things you do without consciously deciding to do them. Every morning, without any sense of effort or resistance. These might be the coffee routine, checking email first thing, a morning walk, brushing your teeth at a specific time. Notice that these behaviors require essentially no willpower at all. They have been transferred. They live in the basal ganglia now, not in the prefrontal cortex's daily deliberation. Now name 3 behaviors you want to be consistent with but that currently require ongoing daily effort or willpower to maintain. These are your current targets for automation, the things you want to transfer from effortful to automatic. For each of these target behaviors, ask, do I currently have a reliable, consistent cue that triggers it? Something specific, a time of day, a physical location, a preceding action that could serve as the on switch for the loop? If not, what cue could you design? What moment already happens reliably in your day that you could attach this behavior to? Finally, think back to a time, any time, when you were genuinely consistent with something for an extended period. A job, an exercise routine, a relationship practice, anything. What made it automatic then? What conditions were in place that supported the consistency without requiring daily willpower? Your honest answers to this last question tell you something true about the conditions under which your discipline actually works. They are the starting materials for the system you're about to build. Chapter 2: Why Your Brain Resists. In the mid-2000s, a team of behavioral researchers at the University of British Columbia ran an experiment that sounds almost insultingly simple. They asked participants to do nothing. Not to meditate, not to rest deliberately, not to enjoy a quiet moment, just to sit alone with their thoughts, in a plain room, with nothing to interact with, for 15 minutes. No phone. No book. No music. Just themselves and the contents of their own minds. The majority of participants found this so aversive that in a follow-up version of the experiment, given the option, a significant portion chose to administer mild electric shocks to themselves rather than continue sitting with their own thoughts. These were people who had rated the same electric shock as painful and who had said, beforehand, that they would pay to avoid it. Given the choice between that discomfort and the discomfort of unmediated mental solitude, many people chose the shock. This tells you something essential about the brain you're working with every morning when you try to do the important thing and instead find yourself on your phone, in your email, reorganizing the kitchen, or simply staring at nothing. The resistance you experience, the way your attention slides sideways, the way the body simply won't move toward the desk, the way the excellent intentions of last night somehow evaporate in the first 5 minutes of the day, is not weakness. It is not a character flaw. It is the predictable, well-documented output of a brain that was designed for a world that no longer exists, operating in a world it was never designed for. A brain built for survival, not productivity. Your brain was shaped over millions of years of evolutionary pressure in conditions that bear almost no resemblance to the ones you currently inhabit. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, the dominant challenges were survival level and immediate: finding food in an environment of scarcity, avoiding predators, managing the complex social dynamics of a small tribal group, conserving energy against the constant possibility of famine, injury, or displacement. The brain that evolved to navigate these challenges is structurally and functionally the same brain you were trying to use to sit down and work on your business plan at 9 in the morning. Several features of that brain are spectacularly well adapted to a survival environment and spectacularly poorly adapted to modern demands. The most foundational is the orientation toward immediate reward over delayed gratification. In an environment of genuine scarcity and genuine unpredictability, the brain that prioritized certain, immediate gains over uncertain future ones survived and reproduced at higher rates than the brain that waited for better opportunities that might never materialize. A calorie-dense food source in front of you now was worth more than a hypothetical food source tomorrow, because tomorrow brought drought, predators, or competition. This preference for the immediate and certain over the delayed and contingent is not a defect in your brain. It is a solution, a highly effective solution to a real optimization problem in the environment your ancestors navigated. The problem is that you are now operating in an environment where almost all of your most important goals are long-term and where the most rewarding things in the short term have essentially nothing to do with those goals. The second feature is a powerful bias toward energy conservation. In an environment where calories were genuinely scarce and physical safety was genuinely uncertain, burning energy unnecessarily was not laziness, it was potentially lethal. An organism that could resist the pull toward effortful activity unless the reward was clear, proximate, and sufficiently large would conserve resources for when they were critically needed. This is the force behind what feels, from the inside, like laziness or procrastination, the pull toward inactivity or low-effort activity when high-effort activity is available. Your brain is not malfunctioning when it resists the effort of focused work. It is following deeply embedded instructions about resource management that were installed by millions of years of selection pressure. The third feature is a threat detection and response system that is calibrated for physical danger but that fires with equal urgency in response to social and psychological threats. The anxiety that precedes a difficult conversation, the dread that shows up when you sit down to do creative work that might expose you to judgment, the discomfort of doing something you're not yet good at in a situation where others might observe the inadequacy, all of these activate the same amygdala-driven fight-or-flight architecture as physical danger. Your nervous system doesn't carefully distinguish between a physical predator and the possibility of failing at something that matters to you. It responds to threat, and the modern world is full of social, psychological, and reputational threats that the ancient system registers with the same urgency it would register a tiger. None of this is a malfunction. These are elegant, effective adaptations to real evolutionary pressures. The problem is the mismatch, the gap between the world these features were calibrated for and the world you're actually trying to operate in. And the mismatch is not small. It is, in some ways, nearly complete. Dopamine and the hijacking of reward, the neurotransmitter at the center of motivation, anticipation, and habit formation, is dopamine. The popular understanding of dopamine as a pleasure chemical, the thing that floods your system when something good happens, has been significantly refined by more recent neuroscience, particularly the landmark work of Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan and Wolfram Schultz at Cambridge. Their research, carried out over decades, distinguishes between two distinct neurochemical systems, the wanting system and the liking system. Dopamine, the research shows, is primarily a wanting chemical. It drives anticipatory motivation, the urge to approach, to pursue, to engage with something you've learned to associate with reward. It fires not primarily at the receipt of a reward but at the cue that predicts reward, the notification sound, the image on a screen, the familiar sensory context associated with something pleasurable. Dopamine is the system that makes you reach for your phone before you've consciously decided to reach for your phone. The cue, a moment of boredom, a slight social anxiety, a brief pause in activity, triggers the wanting system before your prefrontal cortex has had time to weigh in on whether reaching is a good idea. In an environment where rewarding things were rare and required significant effort to obtain, this system was enormously useful. The wanting that preceded the effort was motivationally essential, it provided the drive to go get the thing. The problem emerges in an environment where an entire industry has spent billions of dollars and decades of engineering talent figuring out how to keep the wanting system perpetually and optimally activated. Your phone is not a distraction. It is a precision dopaminergic delivery mechanism, a device engineered specifically to trigger the wanting system at maximum intensity and minimum friction, with the unpredictable reward intervals, what behavioral researchers call variable ratio reinforcement, that neuroscience has identified as the most powerful reinforcement schedule for maintaining compulsive behavior. This is the same reinforcement schedule that makes slot machines so difficult to walk away from. The people who designed the apps you use compulsively had access to the same neuroscience you're reading right now. They've been applying it longer, with more resources, and with the explicit commercial goal of defeating the intentions you're trying to act on. Social media platforms, streaming services, news feeds, and most digital entertainment are designed with the explicit objective of maximizing engagement, which, at the neurological level, means maximizing the activation of the wanting system and minimizing the behavioral cost of continuing to feed it. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the business model, openly documented by the engineers who built it. Understanding it clearly does not make you immune to it, but it changes the nature of the problem. You are not failing a willpower test. You are losing, repeatedly, to an optimized system designed to defeat you. The correct response to being outmatched in a willpower contest is not to develop more willpower. It is to change the contest. Why willpower alone fails? Roy Baumeister, a social psychologist at Florida State University, spent the better part of 2 decades studying the mechanisms of self-control and the phenomenon he termed ego depletion. The original framework he developed, drawing on findings from multiple experiments, proposed that self-control operates like a muscle that fatigues with use, that acts of willpower draw from a limited reservoir that is progressively depleted across a day, leaving less available for subsequent acts of self-regulation. In one of his most widely cited early experiments, Baumeister and his colleagues brought research participants into a room that smelled of freshly baked cookies and placed them in front of 2 bowls, one containing warm chocolate chip cookies and one containing radishes. One group was invited to eat freely from the cookies. A second group was instructed to resist the cookies and eat from the radishes instead. Both groups were then asked to persist on a frustrating, unsolvable puzzle. The radish eaters gave up significantly faster, an average of about 8 minutes compared to nearly 19 minutes for the cookie eaters and control groups. The interpretation was that the act of resisting the cookies had drawn from the self-control resource, leaving the radish group with less capacity to persist on the subsequent task. The specific ego depletion framework has been contested, refined, and complicated by subsequent research. Some replication attempts have been mixed, and alternative mechanisms, the role of motivation and expectation, the influence of beliefs about self-control as a limited or unlimited resource, have been proposed and studied. The picture is more complex than the original simple resource depletion model suggested. But the core empirical observation that extended effortful self-regulation impairs subsequent self-regulation, and that the experience of resisting one kind of temptation makes resisting subsequent temptations harder, has held up broadly across many different research contexts and paradigms. You have experienced this yourself. The commitments that felt clear and accessible in the morning feel labored and negotiable by evening. The discipline that came easily when you were fresh has a different quality when you've been making decisions and managing demands for 12 hours. This is not dramatic variability in your character. It is biological and behavioral reality. The implication is straightforward and important. A discipline system built primarily on willpower is built on a resource that is finite, that diminishes over the course of every day, and that is most abundant precisely at the moment when most people are doing the least important things, checking their phones in bed, and most depleted at the moment when they most need it, trying to maintain commitments in the face of the day's accumulated demands and the evening's abundant temptations. Building discipline on willpower alone is like building a water system around a bucket, useful up to a point, but structurally inadequate for the scale of the need. The modern amplifiers beyond the engineering of digital platforms, several features of modern life create conditions that compound the brain's natural resistance to disciplined behavior in ways that earlier generations simply did not face at anything close to the current scale. The sheer volume of information demanding your attention is genuinely unprecedented. Human beings evolved in information environments that were dense with the specific, locally relevant information needed for immediate survival and social navigation. The modern information environment bears no resemblance to this. The volume of information available, the rate at which it changes, the number of sources competing for your attention simultaneously, all of this creates a cognitive load that competes directly with the executive function required for self-regulation. When your mental bandwidth is substantially consumed by incoming information, the resources available for deliberate, goal-directed behavior are correspondingly reduced. You cannot have a depleted attentional system and an effective self-regulatory system simultaneously. They draw from the same well. The social environment has shifted in ways that make undisciplined behavior easier to normalize. When the people around you are distracted, when checking phones during conversations is culturally ordinary, when working in fragmented, distracted bursts is the ambient norm in most work environments, when late nights and disordered schedules are presented as signs of dedication rather than poor self-management, the social friction against those patterns is low to non-existent. The mirror that your social environment holds reflects a norm that is not serving you, and it reflects it back so consistently that the norm starts to feel like simply the way things are. Barry Schwartz's work on the paradox of choice is also relevant here. When options are limited, decisions are simple and relatively low cost to make. When options are unlimited, and in the contemporary consumer, entertainment, and information environment, options in nearly every domain are effectively unlimited, the cognitive and emotional cost of choosing rises substantially, and the common response is either paralysis or default to whatever is easiest and most familiar. In behavioral terms, this means defaulting to whatever pattern is most established, most habituated, most automatic. Which, for most people in most domains, is the comfortable, immediate reward pattern rather than the disciplined, delayed reward one. All of this context matters not as excuse but as accurate diagnosis. If you have been experiencing your discipline problem as a personal failing, as evidence that you lack the character or willpower or desire that other people have, you have been misidentifying the problem at a fundamental level. The problem is a mismatch between your evolutionary heritage and your contemporary environment, compounded by a commercial infrastructure designed to exploit that mismatch for profit. That is a real and significant structural problem. But unlike your evolutionary heritage, your environment is highly and specifically changeable. The principle that changes everything. Every practical tool in this book flows from one foundational principle that Chapter 2 exists to establish clearly: do not try to overcome the brain's resistance through effort. Redesign the environment so the resistance has less to work with. Your limbic system will always pull toward immediate comfort and familiar reward. Your prefrontal cortex will always have a limited daily budget for effortful self-regulation. Your dopamine system will always be potentially hijackable by anything engineered to exploit it. These are not problems that yield to effort. They are features of the hardware, present in every person who has ever lived and likely to remain present in you for the rest of your life. What is not fixed is the environment those systems operate in. You can make the phone physically difficult to access during work hours. You can make the workout clothes the first thing you see in the morning. You can make the important task the only thing open on the screen when you sit down to work. You can eliminate the decision about whether to do the important thing by deciding once, at the system level, that it always happens at this time, in this place, before anything else, so that the brain's resources are never deployed on the whether question, only ever on the how. You can, in other words, redesign your environment so that your ancient, easily hijacked, effort-conserving brain is consistently pointing in the direction you actually want to go, not because you've overcome its nature, but because you've arranged the furniture so its nature leads somewhere useful. This is not a mystical reframe. It is a practical engineering approach to a real problem that has a real solution. The chapters that follow will show you exactly how to apply it. Practical reflection. These questions are designed to help you see your specific brain environment mismatch with the precision needed to design around it. Generic awareness of being distracted doesn't help much. Knowing exactly when, how, and in response to what your resistance most reliably appears gives you specific targets for environmental redesign. Identify the time of day when your discipline is strongest and when it most reliably collapses. Write down both specifically, with as much precision as you have. What are the conditions in each period? Name the single digital distraction that costs you the most time and focus on a typical day. Be honest, not the one that sounds most reasonable to identify, but the actual one. When does it most commonly happen? When you imagine sitting down to do the most important work available to you right now, and you notice resistance, what does that resistance feel like in your body? Is it physical tension? A blankness? Anxiety? Boredom? Name it as precisely as you can. What is the first default behavior your brain reaches for when that feeling appears? This is the cue routine of your resistance loop, and it's exactly what you'll be redesigning in Part 3. Chapter 3, The Discipline Audit. In the early 1990s, a medical sociologist named Anselm Strauss spent time embedded in hospital burn units, studying how patients recovered from catastrophic injuries. He was not primarily interested in the medical interventions. He was interested in something subtler and less studied: why, given identical injuries and identical treatment protocols, some patients recovered dramatically better than others. What he found was that the patients who did best were not necessarily the ones with the most optimistic attitudes or the strongest social support networks or the most medical compliance, though those things helped. They were the ones with the most accurate, honest, and specific understanding of their own patterns, who knew, with precision, what made their particular recovery harder and what made it easier, who could name their specific failure points rather than describing their struggle in vague generalities, and who could therefore make targeted decisions rather than generic ones. Self-knowledge that is specific and unsentimental, Strauss found, is not just philosophically valuable. It is practically powerful. The more precisely a patient understood their own particular situation, not the average burn patient's situation, their situation, the more effective their choices about it could be. The same principle applies here, with equal force. Discipline doesn't fail for one universal reason. It fails in different ways for different people, driven by different neurological and psychological mechanisms, expressing itself in different behavioral patterns, and responding to different kinds of structural intervention. Treating all discipline failures as identical, responding to all of them with the same general prescription of get a morning routine or just try harder or find your why, is one of the most significant reasons generic advice about discipline so rarely holds in practice. Before you can fix the system, you need to know which part of your particular system is broken. This chapter is a diagnostic. It will help you identify which of 4 primary patterns of discipline failure is most dominant in your life right now. By the end, you'll have named your type and you'll understand exactly why that identification matters for choosing the right reset protocol in Part 3. The 4 profiles of discipline failure. These 4 profiles are not rigid personality types in the fixed, deterministic sense. They are not boxes that contain you or permanent diagnoses about who you are. They are patterns, recurring, recognizable clusters of thought, behavior, and avoidance that tend to cluster together and that have specific causes, specific internal experiences, and specific structural remedies. Most people have elements of more than one profile, sometimes with strong secondary characteristics from a second category. But there is almost always a dominant pattern, the one that accounts for the majority of your discipline failures, the one you recognize most readily from the inside. That dominant pattern is what we're identifying. Once you've named it, the specific sections of Part 3 that most directly address it will be clear. Profile 1, the starter. The starter is, in many ways, the most seductive profile to inhabit, because it comes packaged with a genuine feeling of capability. The starter has real energy at the beginning of things, real, not performative. They sign up for the gym with genuine intention. They begin the creative project with honest enthusiasm. They make the plan, start the diet, open the new document, set the morning alarm, and for a period, sometimes days, sometimes a week or 2, they actually do it. The habit is happening. The morning is earlier. The work is getting done. The momentum feels genuine and promising. And then, at some point that is consistently hard to predict in advance, the energy simply isn't there anymore. Not dramatically, not with any specific external cause, the excitement of the new thing has faded, and what remains is just the work itself, stripped of its novelty, reduced to the repetitive, unglamorous reality of showing up again on a day when the behavior doesn't feel special anymore. For the starter, this is the moment of silent collapse. Not a dramatic quitting, they rarely quit formally, but a gradual, unremarked withdrawal. The gym visits spread apart. The project file opens less frequently. The morning alarm moves later, then gets ignored, then gets changed. By the time the starter fully notices they've stopped, enough time has passed that restarting feels like a fresh beginning rather than a continuation, and the cycle is ready to begin again. From the inside, the starter often doesn't experience themselves as someone who quits. They experience themselves as someone who starts, which is true, as far as it goes. They have real, documented experience of beginning things. The problem is that starting without sustaining produces very little over time. All that genuine energy, applied repeatedly to the least valuable phase of the habit lifecycle, generates an impressive catalog of beginnings in almost no depth. The value of a disciplined practice is almost entirely in the compounding, in the second month, the sixth month, the second year. That compounding is exactly what the starter never reaches. The specific failure point for the starter is at the transition from novelty to routine, the moment when the dopaminergic charge of the new thing evaporates and what's left is just the behavior, present in the schedule, available to be done, ordinary. The brain has been rewarding the starter for beginning, via the dopamine associated with new goals and fresh intentions. It has not yet built the different, more durable structures that make continuing happen automatically even after the novelty reward has stopped. What the starter most needs is not more motivation to begin, they have that in abundance, and more motivation to begin will simply produce more impressive beginnings followed by the same pattern of fading. What they need is a structural bridge over the novelty gap, a system specifically designed to carry them through the period when the new thing has stopped being new and hasn't yet become habitual. The commitment to tracking, the accountability element, and the specific slip protocol built into the Level 1 reset are particularly designed for this gap. Profile 2, the perfectionist. The perfectionist has a discipline problem that presents itself, from the inside, as a standards problem rather than an avoidance problem. The perfectionist isn't avoiding, they're preparing. They're not being lazy, they're being responsible. They're waiting to feel ready. They're waiting for the slightly less hectic week that will allow them to give the thing the attention it deserves. They're waiting until they've done a bit more research, cleared their schedule of the current obligations, finished the preliminary groundwork that will make the actual beginning more legitimate. The internal experience of this waiting is not painful in the way procrastination typically is. It feels, much of the time, quite reasonable. The perfectionist genuinely cares about doing the thing well, and they are genuinely aware that half-hearted attempts at important things produce half-hearted results. The waiting feels like wisdom, like they're protecting the thing by not rushing it, honoring its importance by not beginning before they're properly equipped. The standards feel like evidence of taking things seriously. From the outside, and this is typically the perfectionist's most important and most uncomfortable realization, the behavior is functionally indistinguishable from not doing the thing at all. The person who is perpetually preparing to write the book and the person who has simply decided not to write the book produce identical outcomes: no book. The person who is waiting for the right moment to launch the business and the person who has simply decided not to launch the business are, from any external perspective, in the same position. The intention, however genuine, is entirely invisible in its absence of expression. The deeper issue for the perfectionist is a belief, usually below the threshold of explicit awareness, that imperfect execution is worse than no execution, that doing the thing badly somehow forecloses the possibility of doing it well, or creates a record of inadequacy that the clean slate waiting period does not. This belief is logical in a narrow sense: a bad first draft is bad, no first draft is not bad, but catastrophically impractical, because it consistently produces no execution in domains where imperfect execution, sustained over time, would eventually produce excellent execution. What the perfectionist most needs is not higher standards or better preparation. They need a structural commitment to beginning with conditions as they are, a forced start in imperfect circumstances, a system that removes the option of waiting by making the beginning automatic rather than conditional. The Level 1 Reset's rule that the decision is about when and how, never about whether, is particularly designed for this profile. Profile 3, the Reactor. The Reactor is conditionally disciplined, and the condition is internal state. When the motivation is high, when the project is going well, when the morning arrived with enough sleep and the right kind of energy, when the goal feels sharp and real and achievable, the Reactor is genuinely capable and genuinely impressive. On those days, they work hard. They show up. They do the difficult thing. They can be, on their best days, the most capable-looking person in the room. But their discipline is entirely dependent on an internal state that they cannot reliably control or produce. On the days when the motivation isn't there, when they're tired or stressed or going through something difficult, when the work is in a hard stretch and the rewards are not visible, when the goal has temporarily lost its sharpness, the reactor is functionally absent. Not dramatically, they might be physically present, might open the document, might sit at the desk. But nothing is actually happening in any meaningful sense. The appearance of working substitutes for the reality of it. The reactor often describes themselves with a kind of comfortable self-awareness as someone who works in bursts or someone who needs to be inspired to do their best work. These are accurate descriptions of the pattern, presented as personality features rather than discipline failures. And there is something to the observation: some people do have more variable internal states than others. The problem is not the variability itself. The problem is the reactor's implicit operating assumption that internal state is a legitimate prerequisite for action, that waiting for the right feeling before beginning is a rational management of their particular psychology rather than an abdication of the agency they actually have. The compound cost of this pattern, over time, is larger than the reactor typically accounts for. Skills require consistent practice to develop and consistent use to maintain. Projects require consistent momentum to progress. Relationships built on commitments that are honored only when it's emotionally easy develop a characteristic brittleness. The reactor's burst productivity, as real and sometimes as impressive as it is, simply doesn't compound the way consistent engagement does. What the reactor most needs is a system that structurally decouples behavior from feeling, that creates behavioral commitments which execute regardless of the internal state, that treats the motivation question as settled rather than as something to be revisited every morning. Implementation intentions, the accountability structure, and the action-first architecture of all three reset protocols address this profile directly. Profile 4, the avoider. The avoider is, in some ways, the most self-aware of the four profiles, and this self-awareness is simultaneously their most important asset. And the thing that most effectively paralyzes them. The avoider knows, with real clarity, what they should do. They're often intelligent and analytical about their situation, they can articulate the goal precisely, describe in accurate detail what behavior would be required to achieve it, explain convincingly why it matters. The understanding is genuine and often quite sophisticated. But there is something specific about the hardest, most important task, the one that would most significantly move the needle, that they consistently sidestep. And they sidestep it with extraordinary productivity at everything else. The avoider's email is managed beautifully. Their administrative tasks are handled with admirable efficiency. Their workspace is organized, their colleague relationships are maintained, their secondary projects are moving. The one thing, the creative project, the business they know they should be building, the health issue they've been deferring, the difficult conversation they've been circling, doesn't happen. From the inside, this doesn't feel like avoidance, which is what makes it so difficult to interrupt. It feels like legitimate productivity. There is real work being done, real tasks being completed, real value being created. The fact that the most important work isn't happening can be continually explained by the volume of everything else that needed to happen instead. The avoider is never idle. They are very busy not doing the thing. What's operating beneath this pattern is almost always fear of some specific kind, though it may not present itself as fear. The most important task tends to be most important precisely because it carries the most significant stakes, the possibility of failure, the possibility of judgment, the possibility of discovering that the capacity for it that you believe you have turns out, on actual engagement, not to be there. Avoidance is a sophisticated, largely automatic protection against the discomfort of that confrontation with stakes. It doesn't announce itself as fear. It announces itself as responsible prioritization, or as needing more time to prepare, or as a recognition that other things have to come first. What the avoider most needs is a system that places the avoided task structurally first, that creates an architectural condition in which the hard thing must be encountered before the productive alternatives are available. The one hard thing before anything comfortable rule in the Level 3 protocol, and the action-first architecture of all three resets, address this profile specifically. Why your type changes everything. The reason Part 3 offers three-tiered protocols rather than one universal system is not primarily about effort level or how disciplined you already are. It is about the fact that the different failure patterns genuinely require different structural solutions. The starter needs a bridge over the novelty gap, specific mechanisms that sustain behavior through the transition from new to routine. The perfectionist needs a forced beginning in imperfect conditions, a structural removal of the option to wait. The reactor needs behavioral decoupling from feeling, implementation intentions, accountability, and action-first rules that execute regardless of the internal state. The avoider needs the hard thing at the front of the queue, an architectural condition that removes the possibility of productive avoidance. When the protocol matches the failure pattern, it addresses the actual cause rather than the visible symptom. When it doesn't, even a well-designed system tends to produce the same results as everything else you've tried: initial progress followed by the same collapse at the same familiar point. Practical reflection: the self-scoring audit. Answer each question honestly and independently. Score from 1, almost never true of me, to 5, very frequently true of me. Don't second-guess or average your answers, give your honest first response to each. Then add up your totals. Profile 1, the starter. 1. Start something new. I feel genuinely energized and committed in a way that seems real and sustainable. 1 to 5, when the initial excitement of a project or habit fades after the first week or two, I find it significantly harder to continue doing the thing. 1 to 5, looking back honestly at the past 2 years, I have more abandoned beginnings than sustained commitments. 1 to 5, starter total. Profile 2, the perfectionist. I regularly delay beginning something important until I feel that the conditions, my schedule, my preparation, my readiness, are sufficiently right. 1 to 5, I spend significant time planning, researching, or preparing before I am willing to actually begin the thing I'm planning for. 1 to 5, when I honestly examine my reasoning for not starting something, I often find that I believe doing it imperfectly would be worse than waiting to do it properly. 1 to 5, perfectionist total. Profile 3, the reactor. There is a marked difference in my behavior between days when I feel motivated and days when I don't. On low motivation days, very little of what matters gets done. 1 to 5, my consistency with important habits or goals is highly dependent on my current mood, energy level, or general psychological state. 1 to 5, if someone who knows me well described my work or practice patterns, they would likely say I operate in bursts, intense and productive in some periods, absent in others. 1 to 5, reactor total. Profile 4, the avoider. I am often more productive at secondary, lower stakes tasks than at the one task that would most significantly advance my most important goal. 1 to 5, there is currently at least one specific task or domain in my life that I have been avoiding for more than 2 weeks, even though I know it matters and I know what I should do. 1 to 5, when I think about beginning the most important task available to me, I reliably feel a form of discomfort, anxiety, blankness, dread, or a pull towards something else before I've even begun. 1 to 5, avoider total. Your highest score indicates your dominant profile. If 2 scores are within 2 or 3 points of each other, read both of those profiles carefully and notice which one resonates at a deeper gut level. Intellectual recognition often shows up in the lower score, while the felt sense of recognition points to the dominant pattern. Carry this self-knowledge into part 3, and let it guide which elements of each protocol you prioritize most. Chapter 4, The Consistency Problem. In 1999, a psychologist named Peter Gollwitzer at New York University published a paper that should have changed the way people think about the problem of acting on their own intentions. He had spent years studying a question that seems almost too basic to require research: why do so many people fail to follow through on goals that are genuinely important to them, even when they have fully formed intentions and no apparent external obstacles? His findings were striking in their simplicity and their implications. When people formed what he called implementation intentions, plans specified in the format, when situation X arises, I will perform behavior Y, their rates of follow-through improved dramatically compared to people who had formed only general goal intentions. Across dozens of studies, the implementation intention effect was consistent and often substantial. In some research contexts, people who had formed specific when-then plans were 2 to 3 times more likely to actually perform the intended behavior than those who had simply resolved to do it. The mechanism driving the effect, Gollwitzer argued, is not motivational. Making an implementation intention doesn't make you want the goal more intensely or care about it more deeply. What it does is offload the decision about when and how to act from the in-the-moment conscious mind, which is operating under the pressures of competing demands, depleted willpower, and situational cues pulling in various directions, to a predetermined plan that activates more automatically when the specified cue appears. You've already decided. The cue fires the behavior without requiring a fresh deliberative act. The decision load disappears from the moment and is replaced by an execution. What Gollwitzer had identified was not just a technique. He had identified one of the central mechanisms through which consistency fails and one of the clearest architectures for sustaining it. The real cost of inconsistency. Before exploring solutions, it's worth sitting with the problem directly for a moment, not in the abstract but in the specific way it actually costs you, because the cost is larger and more compounding than it typically feels on any individual day when you've missed. The most immediately visible cost is the simplest. When you don't do the thing consistently, you don't get the results the thing produces. The workout not done doesn't build the fitness. The writing session skipped doesn't produce the chapter. The difficult conversation avoided doesn't resolve the relationship tension. The habit practiced once a week versus 6 times a week produces dramatically different outcomes in every domain that matters. At the level of a single missed day, this is easy to dismiss. One day, you tell yourself, doesn't really matter. And in isolation, it genuinely doesn't. The problem is that one missed day is rarely actually one missed day. It is a pattern with a specific recurrence, and the pattern, not the individual instance, is what determines outcomes. The subtler and ultimately more significant cost operates at the level of identity rather than output. Research on self-efficacy, the belief in one's own ability to execute a specific behavior and to persist through difficulty, is one of the most robust bodies of work in behavioral psychology. Albert Bandura at Stanford demonstrated across decades of work that self-efficacy is built primarily through mastery experiences, the direct, personal experience of doing the thing successfully. Every time you do what you said you'd do, your self-efficacy for that behavior increases slightly. Every time you don't, it decreases slightly. The effect is asymmetric. Self-efficacy is harder to build than to erode, and its erosion tends to be faster than its construction. This means that the pattern of inconsistency is self-perpetuating in both directions. Failure erodes self-efficacy, which makes the next attempt slightly less likely to succeed, which produces more failure, which erodes self-efficacy further. Success builds self-efficacy, which makes the next attempt slightly more likely to succeed, which produces more success, which builds self-efficacy further. The identity, the story you tell yourself about whether you are the kind of person who can do this, is not fixed. It is being updated continuously by the evidence of what you actually do. That means early consistency is not just instrumentally valuable for the habits it produces. It is critically valuable for the identity it begins to construct, which then supports the habits, which builds more identity, in a compounding loop that runs in whichever direction you've established. Why consistency is harder than one-time effort? It is, for most people in most domains, easier to do a hard thing once than to do a less hard version of the same thing repeatedly over a long period. Most people can summon the resources for a single significant performance, the one-time physical challenge, the deadline-driven all-nighter, the high-stakes presentation prepared for under pressure. The resources for one-time performance are accessible in a way that the resources for sustained, daily, unremarkable repetition often are not. There are 2 distinct neurological reasons for this. The first is motivation decay. Motivation for a new goal is partly driven by anticipatory dopamine, the reward signal that fires in response to novel intentions and to the imagined pleasure of their eventual achievement. Like all novelty-based dopamine, this signal diminishes reliably with familiarity. The day you set the goal, the dopamine is elevated. The goal is new, the achievement is still imagined, the possibility is open. By day 14, the goal is familiar, the achievement is the same imagined future you've been imagining for 2 weeks, and the dopamine anticipation that was available in week 1 has faded substantially. Nothing about the goal has changed. Your neurochemical relationship with it has. This is not a sign that the goal is wrong or that your motivation was artificial. It is a predictable feature of the brain's reward system responding to the most fundamental characteristic of novelty: it fades. The second is that habit formation is slow, considerably slower, on average, than the popular expectation. Philippa Lally and her colleagues at University College London tracked how long it actually took for new behaviors to become automatic in a sample of everyday people forming new habits in their real lives. The frequently cited figure of 21 days is essentially a folk myth. Lally's data showed a range of 18 to 254 days, with an average around 66 days, and significant variation depending on the complexity of the behavior and the individual. Most meaningful habit-level behaviors take months to automate, not weeks. This creates a specific window of maximum vulnerability, the period between when the initial motivation fades, often within the first 2 to 4 weeks, and when automaticity kicks in, often not until 2 months in or later. This window is the consistency gap, the most dangerous period in the life of any new habit. The behavior still requires conscious effort, but the emotional fuel that initially made that effort feel manageable has largely evaporated. The structure isn't there to carry the behavior automatically. And the results aren't yet visible enough to provide external motivation. It is the nadir of the habit formation process, and it is where the vast majority of discipline attempts collapse. Understanding this map doesn't eliminate the gap, but it does change your relationship to it. When you know that days 14 through 40 are specifically the hardest stretch of building any meaningful habit, the hardness of those days stops feeling like evidence that the habit isn't working and starts feeling like evidence that you're in the predicted hard stretch that every person who has ever built this habit also went through. The hardness is not a signal to stop. It is a confirmation that you're in the right place at the right time. How missed days build a new identity story. There is a specific psychological mechanism through which missed days erode discipline that is worth examining directly, because understanding it changes how you respond to your own inconsistency in a way that matters practically. When you miss a day of a habit you've committed to, the behavioral consequence is genuinely small. One missed workout doesn't undo your fitness progress. One missed writing session doesn't meaningfully delay the book. The physical consequences are nearly negligible. But the psychological consequence can be significant, because a missed day creates a specific invitation to a particular narrative. I'm not actually the kind of person who does this consistently. This narrative is peculiarly persuasive because it has partial evidential support. You did, in fact, not do the thing today. And it generalizes from a single data point to a broad character conclusion in a way that feels logical but is, in fact, a reasoning error. One missed day is evidence of a missed day. It is not evidence of a fixed identity. The problem is that this narrative, once entertained, begins to exert subtle pressure on subsequent days. If I'm not really the kind of person who does this, then today's session is either a confirmation of the new story, missing again, or an exception to it, doing it today, against type. Neither framing supports the behavior as well as the original clean frame. I do this, and I missed yesterday, and today I'm back. Consecutive misses amplify the narrative exponentially. The first miss can be absorbed as an anomaly. The second miss confirms the story the first miss suggested. The third consecutive miss has a weight to it that is qualitatively different from the original isolated incident. The habit is beginning to feel like something that used to happen rather than something that is happening, and that shift in tense is more significant than it appears. The research on what James Prochaska called the stages of change is relevant here. People cycle through the same behavior change attempts multiple times before successful maintenance. This is normal, documented, and not evidence of failure. But it is also true that each cycle that ends in collapse reinforces a specific kind of learned pattern. The cycles themselves are not the problem. The narrative that builds up across cycles, the story that says this is the pattern, and the pattern won't change, is what actually defeats sustained change, and it is a story that gets its evidence from the specific mechanics of the consistency gap. The never miss twice principle, one of the most practically useful principles for managing the consistency gap, is deceptively simple: never miss twice. The principle begins from an honest acknowledgement of reality. Perfect consistency, over any extended timeline, is not achievable by most people in most circumstances. Life intervenes: illness, travel, work crises, family emergencies, grief, the unpredictable disruptions that no planning fully accounts for. Demanding perfect consistency is a form of system rigidity that makes the entire structure brittle. When the inevitable miss happens, there's no protocol for it, and the miss becomes catastrophic rather than manageable. Never miss twice is not a compromise on the commitment. It is a strategic decision about where to draw the line that actually matters. The single miss, absorbed as a one-time variance with a clean return the next day, has minimal impact on the trajectory of the habit and minimal impact on the identity narrative. The habit experienced a miss and survived. The identity story remains intact: I do this, and sometimes life disrupts it, and I always return. The consecutive miss is where the real damage begins. The second miss is not twice as bad as the first, it is qualitatively different, because it has changed the status of the miss from anomaly to pattern. And once the miss has become a pattern, the psychology of returning is fundamentally different from the psychology of simply resuming after an isolated disruption. The longer the consecutive streak of misses, the more the return requires a kind of recommitment that has all the features of starting over: the renewed motivation, the fresh decision, the energy that feels different from continuation. And starting over is psychologically costly in ways that simple continuation is not. This means that the most critical discipline decision in any given week is not the decision you make on the easy mornings. It is the decision you make the morning after you missed. That decision, to return immediately, without extended self-recrimination, without a waiting period of reflection, without using the miss as evidence for the "maybe I'm just not this kind of person" narrative, is the decision that determines whether the habit lives or begins to die. It is also a decision that the protocol in Part 3 makes deliberately as easy as possible to make correctly, through the slip protocols and never miss twice architecture built into every reset level. What recovery actually looks like: recovery from a period of real inconsistency, not a single missed day but a week off, a month derailed. A habit you last practiced 6 months ago is often made harder than it needs to be by a specific psychological barrier: the belief that you need to fully reckon with the absence before you can legitimately return. The belief that the size of the gap demands some proportionate period of understanding, processing, or preparation before you have earned the right to simply resume. This is understandable as a form of self-respect, but it is practically counterproductive. The fastest path to recovering consistency is behavioral, not cognitive or emotional. You return to the behavior. Not tomorrow, not after you've diagnosed the full root cause of why you stopped, not after conditions have improved enough to feel like a genuine fresh start. You return to the behavior today, in whatever form is executable today, at whatever scale is honest rather than impressive. The psychological research on learned helplessness is relevant here. Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer's foundational experiments showed that organisms who experience extended inability to affect their outcomes through action eventually stop acting, even when the situation has changed and action would now be effective. A kind of motivational resignation sets in that persists past the original conditions that produced it. Something analogous can develop in people who have experienced repeated cycles of discipline building followed by collapse, a quiet, often unarticulated belief that trying is likely to produce the same disappointing result it has produced before, that the pattern is fixed, that beginning again is beginning the same cycle over. The antidote to this learned pattern, in both the animal research and in the practical experience of human behavior change, is small, structured, immediately achievable wins, returning to behavior in a form that is guaranteed to succeed, that immediately produces the experience of agency and effectiveness, that begins rebuilding the self-efficacy eroded by the period of inconsistency. You don't return to the full protocol after a month off on day 1. You return to the most basic version of the most important non-negotiable. You win that day. You come back the next day and win again. The streak begins again at 1, and 1 counts the same as it did the first time. Practical reflection. This reflection is specifically designed to make your own consistency pattern visible with precision. The value is in the specificity. Vague awareness of being inconsistent is not actionable. A precise map of where and how your consistency breaks is. Choose one behavior that matters to you and that you've been inconsistent with. It could be exercise, creative work, a professional development practice, a health behavior, a relationship habit, anything where you've had an intention and struggled to maintain it. Without judgment, trace what actually happened over the past 4 weeks of that habit as best you can remember. On which days did it happen? On which days did it not? When you can identify them, note what was different about the days when it happened versus the days when it didn't. Was it time of day, your energy, or mood, competing demands, disruptions to routine? Now identify the specific moment the consistency most commonly breaks. Is it a single disrupted day that doesn't recover? A specific day of the week when the routine is weakest? A period of stress that breaks the pattern and doesn't rebuild after the stress passes? The more precisely you can name the breakpoint, the more precisely you can design against it. Finally, examine the story you told yourself after the last significant break. Was it a character statement about yourself? I knew I wouldn't stick with this, I never do. Or was it a situational observation? That week was genuinely unusual and disrupted everything? The character narrative is the one to watch. When you hear it, it's worth writing it down and asking, what is the evidence for this as a fixed truth versus evidence for this as a behavioral pattern that I now understand better and can design around differently? Chapter 5, The Motivation Trap. In the mid-1970s, a psychiatrist named Peter Lewinson at the University of Oregon was trying to understand something specific and important about why his depressed patients stayed depressed. At the time, the dominant treatment models for depression were insight-based, help people understand the origins of their depressive patterns, work through the underlying cognitive or emotional material, and the understanding would create change. Lewinson found that understanding, while sometimes valuable, was not the primary engine of recovery. What actually moved the needle, what changed how people felt, over time, in a way that held, was behavior. Specifically, increasing the frequency of engagement with activities that had previously produced pleasure or a sense of mastery, even when those activities didn't feel rewarding in the moment, even when the person felt no motivation to engage with them, even when everything in their internal state suggested that nothing would help. Not waiting to feel motivated. Not working through the depression until engagement felt natural or possible. Engaging first, with the activity, while the motivation was absent. And watching the feeling follow. He called this behavioral activation, and it was built on an observation that the clinical research has since validated across hundreds of studies in multiple contexts. For most people, in most situations, the causal arrow between motivation and action runs in the opposite direction from the one we naturally assume. The popular assumption is that you feel motivated, and then you act. The evidence shows, consistently, that you act and then you feel motivated. Action produces the motivational state. The state does not produce the action. This is one of the most practically important insights in behavioral psychology, and it is one of the most consistently misapplied pieces of information that exists. The waiting room. Most people, when they want to do something but don't feel like doing it, wait. Not anxiously or consciously, usually, the waiting doesn't announce itself as a strategy. It simply happens. There is a task available, there is an intention to do it, and there is an absence of the feeling that would make doing it feel natural. And so, almost automatically, the mind begins looking for conditions under which the feeling might arrive. Maybe after the coffee is done. Maybe after this bit of email is cleared. Maybe this afternoon, when there's a break in the day and the energy has built back up. Maybe tomorrow morning, when there's a proper fresh start available. This is what I'm calling the waiting room, not a place you consciously choose to enter but a default holding pattern between intention and action, a space that feels like reasonable patience but is functionally a form of avoidance. The waiting room is comfortable because it doesn't require you to do anything, and because the exit condition, the arrival of sufficient motivation, feels genuinely imminent. It always feels like the motivation should arrive soon. It feels like a reasonable thing to be waiting for. The trap embedded in the waiting room is one that the Lewinson insight makes visible. The exit condition you're waiting for is itself produced by the behavior you're waiting to feel motivated to perform. You are waiting for a state that will only be generated by crossing the threshold you're waiting to cross. You can wait indefinitely. The feeling will not arrive independently. It will arrive, reliably and often surprisingly quickly, shortly after you begin, but beginning is the condition, and beginning is the thing you're waiting to feel ready for. This is the motivational loop that keeps people in the waiting room for months, sometimes years, about things that matter enormously to them. Not because they don't care, and not because they're incapable, but because they're operating on a model of how motivation works, that is, at the causal level, backwards. The neuroscience of action first, the behavioral observation that Lewinson made in the 1970s has since been given neurological texture. When you begin an action, even reluctantly, even without enthusiasm, even in the smallest possible form, you initiate a neurochemical sequence that the waiting room does not. The prefrontal cortex, which governs goal-directed behavior and executive function, becomes meaningfully activated by the act of beginning in a way it is not activated by contemplating beginning. Dopamine begins to release in anticipation of and in response to the early micro-rewards of engagement, the sense of forward movement, the satisfaction of small progress, the orientation toward a goal that comes with being in physical or intellectual contact with the work. These are small rewards, not dramatic ones, but they are real, and they are available from the first moments of genuine engagement. The Zygarnik effect, identified by Soviet psychologist Bluma Zygarnik in the 1920s and subsequently replicated across many contexts, is relevant here. unfinished tasks occupy a qualitatively different kind of cognitive presence than tasks that have never been started. A task you've begun but not finished generates a persistent, low-level cognitive activation. The brain continues to process and return to the incomplete work in ways it doesn't engage with completely unstarted work. Beginning, in this sense, is neurologically distinct from not beginning in ways that change the relationship between you and the task almost immediately. Once you've started, the task has a kind of hold on you that it didn't have before. The clinical psychologist Neil Fiore, in his work on procrastination and the psychology of productive states, described how the early stages of engagement with work tend to generate what he called the natural flow of working, a quality of immersion that develops progressively as you stay in contact with the material, that makes continuation more natural and stopping more effortful than the task felt before you started. Most people who write have experienced this. The first 5 minutes in front of a blank document are the hardest part of the session. Once you're in the material, the session tends to develop its own momentum. The barrier was entirely at the beginning, and it was substantially lower than the dread that preceded it suggested. This is not always true in every case. Some tasks remain genuinely unpleasant throughout, and beginning does not always generate flow or meaningful motivation. But the directional truth holds: beginning almost always produces more internal permission to continue than not beginning does. And not beginning produces only more not beginning. The waiting room is self-sustaining once you're in it. The cost of avoidance: the waiting room has a cost that is easy to underestimate day by day, because it operates primarily as an absence. Nothing bad happens visibly when you spend a day in the waiting room. You haven't done anything embarrassing or costly. You've simply not done the thing, which means you've lost the value of the thing for that day, but the loss is invisible and gradual rather than acute. Over a year, the compound cost of habitual waiting becomes very difficult to miss. The work that might have been finished isn't finished. The skill that might have been developed isn't developed. The business that might have been built isn't built. The health that might have been recovered hasn't been. Every domain in which waiting has replaced action has a gap where the compounded results of consistent engagement would otherwise be. These gaps don't announce themselves dramatically on the day they're created. They announce themselves, years later, as a pervasive sense of potential unrealized, of capability applied to the waiting rather than to the doing. There is also a second cost that operates at a more psychological level and that tends to be less acknowledged: the cost of carrying the things that haven't been done. Research by procrastination scholar Fuchsia Sorois at Bishop's University, and earlier work by Timothy Pychyl at Carleton University, consistently documents a robust relationship between chronic procrastination and psychological well-being that runs in both directions. Procrastinators report higher levels of stress, lower levels of life satisfaction, and elevated rates of anxiety and depression compared to non-procrastinators, not primarily because of the practical consequences of what they've left undone, but because of the ongoing psychological burden of awareness without action. The task you've been avoiding is never fully absent from your mind. It hums in the background of your awareness, drawing a small but consistent portion of your attention and creating a low-level ambient guilt or agitation that colors the experience of everything else you do. You're not doing the avoided thing, but you're not free from it either. The waiting room is not peaceful. It is merely suspended. Beginning resolves this. Immediately, reliably, every time. The moment you start the avoided thing, the background hum stops. The cognitive and emotional resources that were being consumed by the avoidance come back online and become available for the work itself. The relief of beginning is not merely motivational, it is neurological, a genuine freeing of attentional and emotional bandwidth that the avoidance had been occupying. Procrastination is not a time management problem. It is worth pausing here to address a framing of procrastination that is extremely common and consistently unhelpful: the idea that procrastination is primarily a time management problem, to be solved by better scheduling, clearer to-do lists, more rigorous planning, or improved organizational systems. This framing produces solutions that don't quite work. Not because calendars and to-do lists aren't useful, but because they address the surface behavior without touching the mechanism driving it. If you could solve procrastination by organizing your time better, you would have done it already. Your problem is not that you don't know what needs to happen or when. Your problem is that something about the task creates an aversive internal state that you are, in an entirely automatic and neurobiologically sensible way, avoiding. The research on this is clear and consistent. Timothy Pychyl and colleagues, and more recently Fuchsia Sirois, have documented across multiple studies that procrastination is fundamentally an emotion regulation strategy, a behavioral response to the anticipation of negative effect associated with a task. The task triggers some form of discomfort, anxiety about whether you can do it well enough, boredom, frustration, the specific kind of dread that precedes doing something you know will be hard, self-doubt about your capacity for the work. The avoidance provides immediate relief from this discomfort. That relief reinforces the avoidance through the same basic learning mechanism that reinforces any other behavior. You avoid because avoidance works immediately, reliably, in the short term. And the short-term effectiveness of the avoidance is precisely what makes it so difficult to interrupt. The solution, accordingly, is not better planning. The solution is the capacity to begin the task in the presence of the aversive feeling rather than requiring its absence as a precondition for beginning. This is a learnable skill. It is, in fact, the core skill of the entire discipline project, the ability to initiate and sustain behavior across the full range of internal states, not just the cooperative ones. Every time you begin before you feel like it, you practice this skill. Every practice narrows the gap between the cue of the aversive feeling and the response of beginning anyway. Over time, the aversive feeling diminishes, partly because you've accumulated evidence that it doesn't prevent action, and partly because the task becomes less threatening with each engagement. The action-first architecture. Every protocol in Part 3 is built on an action-first architecture, and understanding the motivation trap is what makes that architecture make sense rather than simply seeming arbitrary. Action first means that the most important behavior, the non-negotiable, begins before the motivation question is consulted. Before you assess how you feel this morning. Before you determine whether today is a good day for it. Before you open inputs, email, news, social media, that will create competing emotional urgencies and crowd out the internal intention. The non-negotiable happens first because the decision to do it was made at the system level, in advance, and is not revisited in the moment. This sounds simple and is, in some sense, simple. But it requires a specific psychological posture, a willingness to treat the motivation question as closed, to behave as if you have already decided, which you have, by setting up the system, to move your body and open the work before the feeling that makes doing it feel natural has arrived. Most people who consistently do this report the same experience. After 5 to 10 minutes of being in genuine contact with the work, the feeling begins to arrive. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but quietly, in the way that Lewinson's depressed patients found engagement returning not in a moment of breakthrough but in the gradual, repeated experience of doing the thing and finding that it didn't require the emotional state they'd been waiting for. The key design element is the lowest possible activation energy at the beginning. The task should not begin with the hardest, most demanding part. It should begin with the most accessible, lowest friction entry point, the smallest possible move that puts you in genuine contact with the work. Open the document and write one sentence. Do 5 minutes of movement and add from there. Make the first phone call on the list and let the rest follow. Begin, in the smallest possible honest way, and let the motivation follow the action. Practical reflection. This reflection is designed to bring the motivation trap from the abstract into the specific texture of your own life. The goal is to identify the exact places where you're waiting, what you're waiting for, and what the smallest possible beginning would look like. Write down 3 things you have been waiting to feel motivated to do. These can be large, the business you've been circling for 6 months, or small, the conversation you've been postponing, the health appointment you've been deferring, the creative project you keep saving for when you have more energy. Just 3 things, written clearly. For each of the 3, identify the smallest possible first step. Not the first session, the first action. Not the full workout, lacing the shoes and walking to the door. Not the entire conversation, drafting the opening sentence of the message that begins it. The first step should be small enough that failing to do it would feel almost embarrassing, and brief enough that it takes no more than 5 minutes. Then write a specific implementation intention for each one, in the format, when, specific trigger, I will, specific first step, before, specific competing behavior. Be precise. When I sit down with my morning coffee tomorrow, I will spend 5 minutes outlining the first section before I open email. The specificity converts the vague intention into an executable plan. Notice, as you write, whether you feel the aversive state that has been keeping you from these things. Most people, simply by engaging with the task at this level of specificity, begin to experience a version of the discomfort that drives the avoidance. That discomfort is information. It tells you exactly what you're managing when you're in the waiting room. Acknowledge it, name it as accurately as you can, and write the implementation intention anyway. That sentence, "I'll do it when," specific cue, not when I feel ready, is the exit from the waiting room. The door was always there. Chapter 6: Discipline and Your Relationships. In the mid-2000s, John Gottman and his team at the University of Washington published findings from their decades of research into what makes relationships succeed and fail. Most people know Gottman's work for the 4 horsemen: contempt, criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and for his research on the ratio of positive to negative interactions in healthy partnerships. But embedded in that same body of research is a finding that receives far less public attention. One of the most significant predictors of long-term relationship quality is what Gottman called the pattern of small acts of turning toward, the daily micro-behavior of honoring small commitments, responding when you said you would, showing up for the inconspicuous moments rather than just the significant ones. These small commitments, kept or broken, accumulate into what Gottman called an emotional bank account. Every kept commitment makes a deposit. Every broken one, no matter how minor it seems in isolation, makes a withdrawal. Over time, the balance of that account determines whether a relationship is characterized by trust and ease or by the quiet, exhausting vigilance of someone who has learned, through repeated experience, not to rely on you too heavily. What Gottman was describing, without quite naming it this way, is the relational cost of undisciplined behavior. Not the dramatic cost of catastrophic betrayals or explosive failures, but the slow, quiet, compound cost of small inconsistencies, the cost that accumulates unremarked until it has changed the entire character of a relationship, until the person on the receiving end has reorganized their emotional life around the assumption of your unreliability without either of you clearly seeing it happen. How discipline failures show up in relationships. Discipline problems are almost universally framed as private matters, a personal failure that affects primarily the person struggling with it, a battle between you and yourself that other people can be kind about but can't really enter. This framing is deeply, consequentially wrong. The patterns of inconsistency, avoidance, and unfollowed intention that define a discipline problem have a social dimension that is both more extensive and more damaging than most people struggling with those patterns recognize. The most obvious manifestation is through broken promises. These are rarely the dramatic kind, rarely the betrayals that get named directly in relationships, that become the stuff of arguments or ultimatums. They are the small commitments that seemed reasonable when you made them and became inconvenient by the time they arrived. You said you'd handle the thing. You said you'd start the project and show progress by the weekend. You said you'd be home at 7, have the difficult conversation, make the phone call, finish the task that affects someone else's planning. And then, because the discipline to follow through wasn't there when the moment came, the thing didn't happen. For the person who made the promise, the miss often feels minor and genuinely somewhat accidental, a one-time failure that doesn't reflect the overall pattern, an understandable response to the specific circumstances of that particular day. For the person on the receiving end, it rarely feels minor, especially when it is part of an established pattern rather than an isolated event. Every broken promise adds a small, specific data point to the brain's predictive model of that person's behavior. The brain of someone in relationship with an unreliable person does something entirely predictable. It adjusts its expectations downward and begins to plan around the unreliability rather than trusting it away. This adjustment happens gradually, largely outside conscious awareness, and feels to the person making it like simple realism rather than a relational withdrawal. But it is both. And the withdrawal, though quiet and invisible, changes the quality of the relationship in ways that can be extraordinarily difficult to name and very difficult to reverse once established. The invisible transfer of load in intimate partnerships, romantic, domestic, familial, discipline failures often manifest most destructively not as broken promises between two people but as an unequal distribution of the work of daily life. When one person's inconsistency means that their share of the household responsibilities, financial management, parenting tasks, social coordination, or emotional labor is carried imperfectly or not at all, that work doesn't disappear. It transfers. It falls, silently and without negotiation, to the person who is present and attentive and who cannot simply leave it undone. This dynamic is particularly corrosive in partnerships where it persists across months or years, because it creates a structural inequality that is genuinely difficult to discuss. The partner absorbing the extra load may not want to be cast as the complainer or the nag, may love the person they're with and genuinely not want to make an already difficult dynamic feel more adversarial than it already does. They may be uncertain whether to attribute the imbalance to discipline failure or to something more complex: temperament, stress, underlying emotional difficulty, and that uncertainty makes a direct conversation feel both necessary and somehow unfair. So they absorb the work, and they absorb the resentment that comes with consistently absorbed work, and neither person speaks clearly about what is actually happening. Meanwhile, the person whose discipline failure created the imbalance is often genuinely unaware of the full weight of what has been transferred, not because they don't care, but because the work they are not doing is, from their perspective, work they are not doing. It doesn't register in their experience at anything close to the volume it registers in the experience of the person doing it. This perceptual mismatch is not malice or deliberate indifference. It is a predictable consequence of the fact that the cost of not doing something is always invisible to the person not doing it, and always fully visible to whoever absorbs the consequence. Over time, resentment about this imbalance becomes one of the primary sources of conflict in intimate partnerships where one person's discipline patterns are a persistent issue, not because the partners are fundamentally incompatible or because either person is a bad person, but because one person's chronic inconsistency has created a structural inequality that generates ongoing, low-grade friction, and that friction compounds. The partner who has been absorbing the load for 2 years has a very different emotional starting point for conversations about this than the partner who absorbed it for 2 weeks. The time matters. They address this problem promptly. Social isolation from shame. There is a less discussed but genuinely significant relational consequence of chronic discipline failure that tends to compound the others: social withdrawal driven by shame. When you know, as people who struggle with discipline almost always do, that there is a significant gap between the person you present yourself as and the person you're actually being, the normal, predictable human response is shame. Shame is a fundamentally social emotion. It is experienced specifically in relation to how you imagine you appear to the people whose perception of you matters, and one of its most consistent and most studied behavioral consequences is avoidance, not of the behavior that caused the shame, but of the social contexts in which that behavior might be seen or judged. People who have been struggling with discipline often begin, gradually and largely unconsciously, to pull back from the relationships and contexts where their inconsistency is most visible. They become harder to reach. They decline invitations, not because they don't want to be there but because being there means potentially having to account for the ways they've been absent. They stop sharing their goals and projects with people they care about, because sharing creates a kind of accountability, and accountability creates exposure to the gap, and the gap is already too present in their own awareness to also want it present in someone else's. They become, in the language of shame researcher Brené Brown, increasingly small, contracting their social world to reduce the risk of being seen clearly. This contraction is deeply counterproductive for reasons that go beyond the immediate social costs. Isolation removes the very social structures, accountability partnerships, mutual encouragement, shared purpose, the normalizing effect of being around others who are working on the same things, that research on behavior change consistently identifies as among the most powerful supports for sustained change. People change more readily in social contexts than in isolation. The shame-driven withdrawal that discipline failure so reliably triggers is, in this sense, self-perpetuating. The failure creates shame, the shame creates isolation, and the isolation removes the social scaffolding that would have made recovery most possible. The antidote is deliberately counter-shame, choosing, deliberately, to share the struggle with at least one person, before the shame becomes large enough to make that sharing feel impossible. This is not about processing the shame publicly or performing vulnerability. It is the practical recognition that connection, not isolation, is what makes change more likely. The misreading that makes it worse. One of the most common and most damaging dynamics that plays out in relationships where discipline failure is an issue is a fundamental misreading of what the failure means. From the outside, and often from the inside of the relationship, by a partner or family member who has been affected by the pattern, undisciplined behavior is read as evidence of laziness, selfishness, or a lack of genuine care about the commitments involved. This reading is understandable, because the behavioral signature of an undisciplined person and the behavioral signature of a genuinely indifferent or self-centered person can look remarkably similar.
Both result in tasks undone, commitments unmet, and people not shown up for in the ways they needed.
But the experience from the inside of the discipline struggle is quite different from what this reading assumes. Most people who struggle with discipline are not indifferent to their commitments. They are, in many cases, acutely aware of their inconsistency, troubled by it in ways that are intense and sometimes consuming, genuinely distressed by the gap between their intentions and their behavior. The self-criticism that accompanies discipline failure is typically severe and often disproportionate, not helpful self-assessment, but a corrosive inner narrative that is running constantly and making the behavior change harder, not easier. The person who isn't showing up is often simultaneously and invisibly punishing themselves for not showing up, which doesn't help them show up but which does strongly suggest that the failure is not a matter of not caring. This internal reality is almost never communicated clearly, partly because it is genuinely difficult to articulate without sounding like excuse-making, and partly because the person struggling often doesn't fully trust their own account of it. "I care but I can't seem to do it" sounds, when spoken aloud, very much like someone who doesn't care, or at least isn't prioritizing appropriately. The communication failure, the gap between the internal experience and the external behavior, and the inability to bridge that gap with words is one of the most isolating aspects of struggling with discipline within close relationships. In relationships where this misreading has taken hold, one of the most useful reframes is the move from character attribution to behavioral description. Moving from "you don't care enough" to "here is specifically what I need to see happen" starting this week changes the conversation from a debate about character, which is rarely productive, because character is invisible and contested, to a discussion about behavior, which is observable, specific, and actionable. This reframe doesn't excuse the pattern or remove accountability from the person responsible. But it opens the possibility of practical problem solving rather than relational punishment, and practical problem solving is what actually changes behavior. Parenting and the model you're building. The relational dimension of discipline also extends, with particular weight, to parenting. Children observe consistency in their primary caregivers with exceptional clarity, not through deliberate analysis but through the accumulation of thousands of small observations over years, building an implicit understanding of what adults do and don't follow through on, what promises are kept and what promises are revised after the fact, what the relationship between stated intention and actual behavior looks like in the people they trust most. A parent who does what they say they'll do reliably, across both the meaningful commitments and the trivial ones, on the unremarkable ordinary days as much as on the significant occasions, models something that cannot be effectively taught through explicit instruction. They demonstrate, through simple behavioral evidence, that words and actions align, that the internal experience of intending something and the external behavior of doing something are regularly the same thing, that you can trust yourself to be trustworthy. This is one of the most valuable things a parent can pass to a child, and it is transmitted entirely through repetitive behavioral pattern rather than through anything said. The inverse is also transmitted clearly, and has real and documented consequences for children's developing self-regulatory capacities, their trust in adult reliability, and their own expectations about whether intentions and actions typically align. Children raised in environments of chronic adult inconsistency often develop either a hypervigilant tracking of whether commitments will materialize, or a learned resignation in which expectations are held very loosely. Neither is what parents want for their children. Neither is what children deserve. The discipline work you do for yourself is also discipline work you do for them. How discipline transforms relational trust. The reverse of everything described in this chapter is worth dwelling on at some length, because the positive picture is not merely the absence of the problems above, it is a genuinely different quality of relationship that becomes possible when you become reliably consistent. When you become a person who does what you say you'll do, not always, not perfectly across every domain simultaneously, but consistently enough in the areas that most affect the people closest to you, the relational consequences are profound and often surprisingly rapid. Behavioral change is noticed faster than people typically expect, particularly when it runs counter to an established pattern. When someone who has been unreliable becomes reliable, the people in their life feel the change almost immediately, even if they don't trust it immediately. Trust rebuilds carefully, with a period of watchful observation during which the new pattern is being tested and verified. That period can be frustrating if you're the one who has changed, because the changed behavior seems not to be producing changed trust quickly enough. But it is producing it. The evidence is accumulating. The deposits are being made. The account is rebuilding. For intimate partners, this shift can feel like a rediscovery of something that had been quietly lost: an ease, an openness, a willingness to lean that had been replaced, slowly and almost imperceptibly, by an adaptive guardedness. When that guardedness relaxes, the relationship has room to become something more expansive than its own management of uncertainty. Not more dramatic or more romantic in any particular way, but more real, the intimacy that comes from actually trusting that the person next to you will do what they say, from knowing that the weight doesn't have to be carried alone, from experiencing, repeatedly and reliably, that your partner shows up. That experience, being reliably shown up for, by someone who chose to become the person who shows up, is not nothing. It is the foundation on which close relationships are actually built, when they hold. And it begins with Tuesday mornings, and kept promises, and the small unglamorous work of doing what you said. Practical reflection. This reflection asks you to look directly at the relational dimension of your discipline patterns. This can be uncomfortable. Do it anyway. Think through the people in your life who have been most affected by your discipline patterns: partner, family members, close friends, colleagues who depend on you. Identify the one relationship where the impact has been most significant. This might be the relationship where promises are most often broken, where the imbalance of load is most pronounced, where your inconsistency has created the most distance. Write down, as specifically and behaviorally as you can, what the pattern has looked like in this relationship. Not a character assessment of yourself, a behavioral description. What specifically did or did not happen, repeatedly, over what period of time? Then ask yourself, what would change in this relationship if you became reliably consistent in this specific area? Not in the abstract, what would specifically change in this person's daily experience? What would become possible between you that currently isn't, because the current dynamic has made it unsafe, or too tiring, or no longer available? Hold that picture. Not as motivation, motivation is unreliable, as we've established. Hold it as information, as a specific understanding of the relational stakes of the work you're about to do. Then carry it into Part 3. Chapter 7, Level 1, The 7-Day Discipline Reset. In January 2012, a software engineer in Seattle named Brett decided to take his discipline seriously. He had tried and failed before: the gym membership, the side project, the reading habit, the early mornings. He had the book on his phone, the notes app full of intentions, the fresh start feeling at least a dozen times. He told himself this time was different because he had finally found the right system. The system, as it turned out, was not the right system. It was ambitious and complex and required him to be someone he was not yet. He lasted 6 days before the old patterns reasserted themselves, and he spent the next several months in a familiar cycle of trying to figure out what was wrong with him. What was wrong with him was that he was trying to run before he could walk. Not because he lacked capability, but because the system he chose was designed for someone with established discipline habits, not someone building them from scratch. He was trying to fly a plane he hadn't learned to taxi yet. The 7-Day Discipline Reset is for Brett. It's for anyone who has tried before and hasn't made it stick, anyone who feels like they're starting from zero, anyone who needs to demonstrate to themselves, not the world, themselves, that they can do what they say they will do. You don't need a prior streak to start this. You don't need to feel ready. You need to begin. Who this protocol is for this reset is designed for anyone who is new to building discipline systems, who has experienced repeated false starts, or who has recently come off a period of significant inconsistency. It is deliberately not comprehensive. It does not try to fix everything. It tries to do one thing: establish the experience of doing what you said you'd do, every day, for 7 consecutive days. That experience is the foundation on which everything else is built. If you have already established some consistent habits and are looking to go deeper, you may find Level 2 in Chapter 8 more appropriate. But if you're honest with yourself and your pattern is one of starting and stopping, start here. The 5 core daily rules. Rule 1, one non-negotiable task, first thing every morning. The foundation of this entire protocol is a single task, not a list, not a routine, one thing that you identify as your most important daily behavior and commit to doing first thing every morning before anything else. It should take between 20 and 45 minutes. It should be genuinely important to you, not impressive sounding, actually important. And it should happen before email, before the news, before social media, before conversation.
First, the mechanism here is activation energy and prioritization.
By placing the most important behavior first, before the day's demands have had a chance to crowd it out, you ensure that it happens regardless of what the afternoon brings. You also begin every day with a completed act of self-keeping, a done thing, a kept promise, evidence for the story that you are becoming someone who does what they say. Rule 2: no decisions about whether to do the task, only when and how.
The whether question is a trap.
Once you allow whether to do it today as a legitimate question, the answer will sometimes be no, and the reasoning will always sound plausible.
I'm tired.
Work was harder than expected.
I'll catch up tomorrow.
The whether question, once opened, tends to stay open, and an open door to skipping is a door that will eventually be walked through.
Remove the door.
The decision has been made at the system level.
The task happens. The only legitimate questions are when exactly it will happen this morning, right when you wake up? After coffee? After a short walk, and how you'll approach it today. What specifically will you work on during these minutes? These are details, not choices.
The choice was made when you committed to the protocol.
Rule 3: phone in another room during your work block.
Your phone, as established in Chapter 2, is not a neutral
tool during your focus period.
It is an active competitor for your attention, engineered with sophisticated mechanisms to win that competition. The single most effective environmental change most people can make for focus and consistency is physical distance from the phone during the work block.
This is not about willpower.
You are not supposed to feel your phone calling to you from your pocket and heroically resist. You are supposed to place it in another room so that it cannot call to you at all.
The intervention is architectural, not motivational. The phone is in another room. There is nothing to resist. This is the correct solution. Rule 4: track completion daily, binary, done or not done. Every day, you record whether the non-negotiable task was completed.
Not a rating from 1 to 10, not a nuanced assessment of quality, not a grade.
Done or not done. A single mark in a single column. The simplicity is the point.
Tracking creates accountability, generates a visual record of your streak, and activates what researchers call loss aversion, the disproportionate discomfort of breaking a streak compared to the satisfaction of extending it. A chain of daily marks creates a motivational pull to keep the chain unbroken that is distinct from and often more powerful than the motivation to do the task itself.
You are not just doing the task. You are protecting the chain. Rule 5: no catching up, missed days are gone, start fresh tomorrow.
If you miss a day, you do not do twice as much the next day to compensate.
The missed day is gone. It is not a debt.
It is not evidence of failure. It is one data point, and the correct response is a single sentence in writing explaining what happened in 5 minutes of the task, regardless, not to catch up, but to ensure the streak ends with an action, not an absence.
And then tomorrow, you start fresh. The no catch-up rule prevents the perfectionism spiral that ends many reset attempts.
When catching up becomes the response to missing, missing becomes loaded with compounding pressure. Miss one day and you now owe double, and double is harder than single, so you miss again, and the debt grows.
The debt becomes overwhelming.
The protocol collapses.
The no catch-up rule keeps the daily commitment stable regardless of what happened yesterday.
Day-by-day guide, day focused expected feeling. Key rule 1: orientation. Set up your task, your space, your time. Optimistic, a bit serious. Rule 1-2: a resistance appears, the novelty is already fading, harder than expected. Rule 2-3: a first friction point, something competes with the task, tempted to negotiate. Rule 4: for a midpoint slump, this is the hardest day statistically, motivation low.
Questioning. Rule 5. Building, the task is starting to feel familiar, something like routine. Rule 3-6: a momentum, you have a small streak and it matters, lighter, more automatic. Rule 1-7: completion, 7 days is done, proud, but aware it's beginning. All a day 4 deserves special attention because it is statistically the most common abandonment point in short-term habit attempts. The novelty of the new commitment has worn off completely. The habit is not yet automatic.
There is no external event compelling you to continue, and the internal motivation has faded along with the novelty.
This is the day the protocol exists for. This is the day you do it anyway, especially because you don't feel like it. Slip protocol. If you miss a day during the 7-day reset, the following protocol applies precisely. Write one sentence, literally one sentence, about what happened. Not a paragraph, not a full analysis, not a period of self-examination. One sentence. I was exhausted from the work event and couldn't make myself start. This sentence is not a justification. It is a record. Then do 5 minutes of the non-negotiable task. Not the full session. 5 minutes. This is not about catching up, the missed day is still a miss in your tracking. This is about ensuring that the day ends with an action rather than with a pure absence, which changes the identity narrative slightly. You didn't do the full session. But you did something. No spiral.
No extended self-criticism.
No recalibration of whether the goal is right or whether you're the right person for it. One sentence. 5 minutes. Done.
Daily tracking table. Use this table each day. Keep it visible, tape it to the wall near your workspace, keep it in a notebook open on your desk, or maintain it in a notes app you check daily.
Date, non-negotiable task, done?
Y/N, notes day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. The notes column is not for excuses.
It's for one-line observations about what felt different that day, good or bad. Over 7 days, these observations often reveal a pattern that is useful to understand before moving to level 2.
Choosing your non-negotiable task. The quality of your choice here matters enormously, and it is worth thinking about carefully before day 1. A bad choice of non-negotiable task, one that is not genuinely important, or one that is important but scheduled at the wrong time, or one that requires equipment or conditions that aren't reliably available, will cause the protocol to fail in a way that feels like a discipline failure but is actually a design failure.
The non-negotiable task should meet 3 criteria. First, it should be something that you could do in any reasonable circumstance, not something that requires a gym or a specific piece of equipment or a particular location that you won't always have access to. The task should be portable enough to execute on a travel day, a difficult day, a day when your routine is disrupted. Second, it should be something that, if you did it every day for the next 3 months, would produce a meaningful positive change in your life or work, not necessarily a large change, but a real and verifiable one. Third, it should take between 20 and 45 minutes, not more. The Level 1 protocol is not designed for marathon sessions. It is designed for a single, consistent, fully executable daily action.
Examples that work well: 20 minutes of writing on a specific project, 30 minutes of focused reading in a relevant professional area, 30 minutes of movement, walking, yoga, body weight exercise, 20 minutes of focused work on the most important professional task before email is opened, 20 minutes of deliberate practice in a skill you're developing. Examples that tend to fail: work on my project, too vague; exercise, too broad; anything that requires setup or conditions that might not be available. Write the task down specifically before day 1. Every morning before I open email or social media, I will write for 25 minutes on my book chapter is a non-negotiable task. Work on creative stuff is not. Completing the reset when you finish day 7 with the task done and 7 marks in the done column. The correct response is not to stop. 7 days of one non-negotiable task is not a transformed identity. It is proof of concept. It is evidence that you can do it, which is significant and genuinely worth acknowledging, but it is the beginning of a habit, not the completion of one. At the end of day 7, spend 15 minutes reviewing your tracking table and your notes. Ask yourself 3 questions. What did I learn about when my discipline is strongest? What was the hardest moment of the week, and how did I handle it? What would I do differently in a second week? If your honest answer to the last question involves simplifying further, do that. If it involves adding a second non-negotiable task, you may be ready for level 2. Trust the evidence from your own 7 days rather than assumptions about what you should be ready for. The second week decision is important. You have 3 options: repeat the 7-day reset with the same non-negotiable to continue building the habit, modify the non-negotiable if you learned that the original choice wasn't quite right, or move to level 2 if the 7 days went cleanly and you're ready to build more structure. There is no timeline pressure here. Some people repeat the level 1 reset 2 or 3 times before moving on, and those additional weeks are not failures, they are additional foundation. A habit that runs cleanly for 21 days before you add more complexity is more durable than a habit that was rushed into a level 2 framework before it was established. What to expect day 1 and day 2 tend to feel like capability. There's a genuine optimism available in the first 2 days of a new commitment, and you should use it. Set up your environment well, clarify exactly what the non-negotiable task is, make the first 2 days as clean and friction-free as possible. Days 3 and 4 are where the protocol is actually tested. The optimism has faded and the habit isn't yet established. You will want to negotiate. The circumstances will feel like legitimate reasons to skip. Something will come up that provides a plausible justification. This is not a special event. This is the protocol working as designed. This is exactly the moment the rules were written for. Do it anyway. Days 5 through 7 tend to carry a different quality. Not ease, necessarily, but familiarity. The task has stopped being emotionally charged in the same way. It is starting to be a thing you do, rather than a thing you're trying to do. This is the early edge of automaticity, nowhere near complete, but present. Do not expect a transformed identity at the end of 7 days. Do not expect to feel dramatically different from who you were when you started. What you should expect, if you've completed the protocol cleanly, is a specific and verifiable experience. You did what you said you would do, every day, for a week. This sounds small. It is not small. It is the thing that every subsequent layer of discipline is built on. Without it, all the higher level systems are architecture with no foundation. With it, the next level is genuinely available to you. That is what 7 days is worth. Chapter 8, Level 2, the 21-Day Discipline System. In November 1960, a plastic surgeon named Maxwell Maltz published a book called Psychocybernetics, in which he observed that his patients typically took about 21 days to get used to their new appearance after surgery. He was careful in his original text. He wrote that it takes a minimum of about 21 days for old mental images to dissolve and new ones to form. Somewhere in the decades of self-help culture that followed, the minimum disappeared, and the observation about plastic surgery patients' self-perception became a universal law. It takes 21 days to form a new habit. This is not, as we discussed in Chapter 4, accurate as a universal law. Philippa Lally's research placed the average closer to 66 days, with enormous individual variation. But there is something real embedded in the Maltz observation. 3 weeks is long enough to experience meaningful neurological change in response to a new behavior, and short enough to be a tractable commitment rather than an overwhelming one. 3 weeks is the right unit for the intermediate reset, long enough to build genuine structure, short enough to sustain attention. The 21-day discipline system is not a longer version of the 7-day reset. It is a different kind of system, one that moves from the single anchor of level 1 into a more complete architecture, adding accountability, environment design, and weekly review cycles. If the 7-day reset was about proving to yourself that you can do it, the 21-day system is about building the scaffolding of a life that makes doing it the default. Who this protocol is for this reset is designed for people who have some established habit consistency but want to build a more complete and durable discipline system. You may have completed the 7-day reset. You may have some existing habits that are reasonably solid and are looking to add or deepen others. You may have had periods of consistency in the past and are working to reclaim and extend that consistency. If you are genuinely starting from scratch, or if you've tried the 21-day frame before and consistently collapsed around day 10, go back to level 1. There is no shame in the right level. The wrong level, however ambitious it feels, produces the wrong results. The 6 core daily rules. Rule 1, 2 non-negotiables, 1 morning anchor, 1 evening anchor. Where level 1 builds a single point of contact with the most important behavior, level 2 builds 2. The morning anchor is the same architecture as level 1, the most important task, first, before inputs. The evening anchor is a briefer, different quality engagement. It might be a review of the day, a preparation for tomorrow, a secondary creative or physical or relational behavior. The evening anchor should take between 15 and 30 minutes and should mark the deliberate close of the productive day before the decompression of the evening. 2 anchors create a structure around the day, a beginning and an end that are intentional rather than ambient, and they give the day a shape that makes the unstructured middle more manageable. Rule 2, implementation intentions for every task. For every significant task in your day, you will use the format Peter Gollwitzer's research identified as most effective. When X happens, I will do Y. Not I will exercise at some point today, but when I close my laptop after the morning work session, I will change clothes and go for a 30-minute run. The specificity of the trigger and the behavior removes the need for an in-the-moment decision and significantly increases follow-through rates. Write your implementation intentions the night before, as part of your evening anchor. You are not planning, exactly, you are pre-deciding, removing the cognitive load of decision-making from the moments when willpower is most likely to be depleted. Rule 3, Pre-commitment. Tell someone what you'll do each morning. Accountability is one of the most powerful and most underused tools in behavior change. The research on accountability partners is consistent. People are significantly more likely to follow through on commitments when another person is aware of the commitment. Not because the other person enforces it, but because the awareness of being seen changes the internal calculus of whether to act. Each morning, tell someone specifically what you will accomplish that day. This can be a partner, a friend, a colleague, a dedicated accountability group, or even a posted update to a relevant community. The someone doesn't need to follow up or check in, though that helps. The act of stating the intention outward, in specific terms, to a real person, is sufficient to activate the accountability mechanism. Rule 4, 1 environment change per week to make the habit easier. Environment design is covered in depth in Chapter 10, but it enters the system here in a managed way, 1 deliberate environmental change per week, chosen to reduce friction around the most challenging habit. In week 1, this might be as simple as placing your workout clothes next to the bed the night before, or removing social media apps from the first screen of your phone, or moving your coffee maker so that it's adjacent to your writing space. In week 2, it might be scheduling a walking meeting to replace a seated one, or blocking a specific calendar time for the evening anchor. In week 3, it might be a more significant change, rearranging the physical setup of your workspace, making a social commitment that enforces a schedule. The 1 per week constraint is intentional. Too many changes at once make it impossible to assess which changes are actually helping. Rule 5, Weekly review. Did you do what you said? Every Sunday, or whatever day closes your week, you conduct a 15-minute review of the preceding week. You look at your tracking record, your implementation intentions, and your stated commitments, and you answer one question honestly: did you do what you said you'd do? Not did I do a reasonable amount, or was the week productive in spirit? Did you do what you specifically said? The weekly review is not a self-assessment of general quality. It is a reckoning with specifics. This is uncomfortable when the answer is no, and that discomfort is valuable. It is the primary motivational input that drives the system toward greater honesty and greater follow-through. Rule 6, Replace 1 scrolling or distraction habit with 1 productive one. In the 3rd week, you will identify the single most time-consuming distraction habit in your daily pattern and replace it structurally with something that serves your discipline goals. This is not about eliminating the distraction through willpower, it's about replacing the slot it occupies with something that competes effectively for the same time and attention. If you spend 45 minutes on social media before bed, you replace it with 30 minutes of reading and 15 minutes of preparation for tomorrow. If you spend your commute scrolling news, you replace it with a podcast that is directly related to something you're building. The replacement needs to be as accessible and as low friction as the distraction it's replacing, otherwise the brain will revert. The 3-week structure. Week 1 foundation. The first week is about building the 2 anchors and getting clean with implementation intentions. No new habits beyond the core 2. The environment change for week 1 should be minimal, 1 small, easily implemented adjustment. The accountability check-in begins from day 1. This week will likely feel slightly rigid. The structure of implementation intentions and daily tracking creates a level of intentionality that may feel effortful at first. That effort is the correct response. You are building something new, and new things require conscious attention before they become automatic. The rigidity is not a flaw. It is the architecture. Week 2 deepening. In the 2nd week, you introduce accountability at a slightly deeper level, not just stating your daily intentions but checking in at the end of the day with someone about whether they happened. You introduce a slightly more ambitious environment change. And you begin to notice, with some data now available from week 1, where the specific gaps in your system are.
The weekly review at the end of week 1 feeds directly into how you approach week 2. If your morning anchor is solid but your evening anchor is inconsistent, week 2's focus is the evening anchor. If your implementation intentions are specific but you're not honoring them, week 2's focus is the accountability mechanism. The system adapts to your actual pattern, not a hypothetical one. Week 2 typically feels like finding a rhythm, the structure is becoming slightly less effortful, the anchors are starting to feel less like impositions and more like parts of the day, and the accountability relationship, if it's working, starts to generate its own motivational momentum. Week 3 Integration. The third week is where you begin to stack behaviors. Habit stacking, attaching new behaviors to existing ones as triggers, is one of the most effective techniques for building automatic routines. If the morning anchor is working, you attach the second morning behavior to it. Immediately after I finish the anchor, I make my accountability commitment for the day. If the evening anchor is solid, you attach the preparation routine to it. Before I close the evening anchor, I write tomorrow's implementation intentions. Week 3 is also when you eliminate what isn't working. The weekly review after week 2 should have clarified this. What are the parts of the system that are creating friction without generating value? These are adjusted or removed. The goal is a system that is increasingly self-sustaining, not one that requires constant management. Handling social commitments and irregular days. One of the most common points of collapse in intermediate-level discipline systems is the irregular day, the work event that runs late, the social invitation that disrupts the evening anchor, the travel that removes your established physical environment. The key principle for these situations is compression, not cancellation. The non-negotiables do not disappear on irregular days, they compress. If the morning is disrupted, the morning anchor moves to the earliest available window, even if that window is shorter. The evening anchor happens, even if it's 10 minutes rather than 30. The implementation intention adapts. When the dinner ends and I'm back in the car, I will spend 10 minutes on tomorrow's plan before driving home. This principle, do something, however small, rather than canceling, is the discipline equivalent of the never miss twice rule. The irregular day that produces a compressed non-negotiable is very different from the irregular day that produces an abandoned non-negotiable. One reinforces the identity story that the behavior always happens. The other starts the erosion. For social commitments that create genuine conflicts, the advance preparation is the intervention. Decide the night before how you will handle the conflict, at the system level, rather than making the decision in the moment when social pressure and fatigue and depleted willpower are all working against you. Weekly Thought Record Template. Use this template during your Sunday review. Complete it honestly. Day: what I planned, what I did, a gap. Why? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The gap column is the most important. It is the specific behavioral distance between what you committed to and what you did. The why column is a one-line honest explanation, not a rationalization, an explanation. Over 3 weeks, these records become a precise map of your specific failure patterns. Weekly check-in table. Week completion percent, biggest win adjustment for next week. Week 1, Week 2, Week 3 completion percentage is calculated simply, non-negotiables completed divided by total non-negotiables committed to. The goal is not 100% to 100% is a ceiling that makes the system brittle. The goal is above 80% and trending upward. Choosing your 2 anchors. The selection of your morning and evening anchors is the most important design decision in the Level 2 system, and it deserves careful thought before the protocol begins. The morning anchor should be the single most important thing you could do in the morning that would, if done consistently every day for the next 6 months, produce meaningful positive change in your work, health, or creative life. This is the same criterion as Level 1, but the Level 2 version typically involves something slightly more ambitious or more directly related to a major goal. If your Level 1 non-negotiable was 20 minutes of writing, your Level 2 morning anchor might be 45 minutes of writing with a specific output target. If Level 1 was movement, Level 2 might add specificity, a specific workout, at a specific intensity, tracked. The evening anchor should be functionally different from the morning anchor, not a second instance of the same type of activity, but something that serves a different purpose. The most effective evening anchors tend to fall into one of 2 categories: preparation, planning tomorrow, reviewing the day, preparing the environment for the morning's work, or recovery, a deliberate wind-down practice, reading, something that signals the transition from productive mode to rest. What the evening anchor should not be is a digital activity. scrolling, passive streaming, and social media are not anchors. They are the behaviors the evening anchor exists to provide an alternative to. The two anchors create a structure around the day. Everything that happens between them has a bounded container it lives within, and that container, small as it is, changes the psychological character of the day from something that simply happens to something that is, at the level of its beginning and ending, deliberately shaped. What to expect week 1 is uncomfortable in a particular way. The rigidity of the system feels constraining before it feels supportive. You are pre-deciding, tracking, reporting, and reviewing in ways you haven't been doing, and all of that structure requires energy. The temptation in week 1 is to simplify by abandoning one of the rules, usually the accountability commitment, because it feels most socially awkward. Don't. The accountability is doing more work than it appears to be doing. Week 2 tends to feel like you're finding your rhythm. The anchor habits are becoming familiar. The implementation intentions are getting faster to write because the format has become practiced. The weekly review at the end of week 1 has given you real information about your pattern, and you're using it. This week tends to generate some genuine momentum, the kind that makes the first week's rigidity seem worth it. Week 3 shows you who you actually are when the novelty has completely evaporated. By week 3, the system is just a system. There's no fresh start energy, no week 1 optimism, no week 2 momentum. There is just the structure, and whether it holds. This is the most honest week of the 3. What you can do consistently in week 3 is what you're actually building. Be honest about what holds and what doesn't, and let the honesty inform how you set up your sustaining system in Chapter 10. 21 days will not make you a completely different person. But if you do it cleanly, it will make you a person with a functioning system, and that is a genuinely meaningful difference from where you started. Chapter 9, Level 3, The 30-Day Identity Overhaul. In the autumn of 1974, a man named Viktor Frankl, by then already famous for Man's Search for Meaning, his account of psychological survival in the Nazi concentration camps, gave a lecture at a conference in Vienna in which he argued something that struck many of his audience as provocative. He said that human beings, when they fail repeatedly to live by their values, do not simply fall into bad habits. They fall into a false identity. They become, in their own self-conception, someone who cannot. The problem is not the behavior, he argued. The problem is the story the person tells about themselves based on the behavior. And the solution, accordingly, is not primarily a behavioral intervention. It is a narrative one, a systematic revision of the story, supported by new behavioral evidence, until the new story is more credible than the old one. The 30-Day Identity Overhaul is built on this insight. Where Level 1 proves that you can do the thing for 7 days, and Level 2 builds the scaffolding of a functioning system, Level 3 goes deeper. It systematically dismantles the identity narrative built on previous failure and constructs a new one built on a month of deliberate, consistent evidence. This is not for everyone. If you haven't completed a 7-day reset cleanly, start there. If you are dealing with clinical depression, executive function challenges, or other mental health conditions that significantly impair behavioral consistency, this protocol works best alongside professional support rather than as a replacement for it. The 30-Day Identity Overhaul is demanding, and it is designed for people who are genuinely ready to commit to 30 consecutive days of systematic change. Who this protocol is for this reset is for people who have established some disciplined consistency and are ready to fundamentally restructure their identity around it. You've done the work at lower levels, you understand your patterns, and you're ready to go all the way to do the kind of sustained, comprehensive work that produces not just better habits but a genuinely different sense of self. If that description fits, this chapter is for you. The 8 core daily practices. Practice 1, Identity Journaling, 5 minutes every morning. Before anything else, you write for exactly 5 minutes on a single prompt: who am I becoming? Not who do I want to be, a future tense statement that maintains comfortable distance from the present. Who am I becoming, present progressive, actively happening, right now. This is not a gratitude journal. It is not a to-do list. It is a deliberate narrative practice. Each morning, you articulate one small piece of evidence for the identity you're constructing. Yesterday I did the hard thing first. Yesterday I kept the commitment. Yesterday I chose the behavior even when I didn't feel like it. You are building, 5 minutes at a time, an internal record of becoming someone trustworthy to yourself.
The research basis for this practice draws on identity theory and psychology, the work of researchers like Dan McAdams at Northwestern, who has spent decades studying how narrative self-understanding shapes behavior. People act consistently with their self-narratives. When the self-narrative changes even incrementally, even through small recorded evidence, the behavior the narrative permits tends to follow. Practice 2. One hard thing before anything comfortable. Every day begins with the single hardest thing available to you, the most important work, the most avoided task, the behavior with the highest emotional activation cost. Before email. Before social media. Before the comfortable warm-up activities that feel productive but don't actually require much from you. This practice builds a particular muscle, the capacity to meet resistance directly, without first needing a period of comfortable activity to warm up to it. Over 30 days, the experience of beginning with the hardest thing changes your relationship with difficulty. It stops being something you approach gingerly and becomes something you approach as a matter of course. Practice 3. No phone until noon. This is the most structurally demanding rule in the protocol, and the one most likely to generate immediate resistance. The phone is not checked, opened, or consulted until noon or until the morning's essential work is complete, if that happens before noon. Texts are checked once in the morning if necessary for logistical reasons. Social media is not touched. News is not consumed. Email is not opened. The reasoning for this rule was detailed in Chapter 2, but it bears restating here in stronger terms. The first hours of the morning are neurologically distinct, the prefrontal cortex is freshest, decision fatigue is minimal, and the internal state has not yet been colonized by the demands and emotional weather of the external world. These hours are the most valuable of the day for focused, autonomous, self-directed work. Introducing the phone, with its notifications, its social signals, its news, its content optimized for engagement, ends the morning's neurological advantage almost immediately. If no phone until noon is genuinely impossible due to the demands of your work, create the longest no phone block you can maintain in the morning and defend it as if it is non-negotiable, because it is. Practice 4. Daily accountability check-in. In Level 3, accountability goes beyond the casual morning statement of Level 2. You have a specific person, a partner, coach, or accountability group with whom you check in every single day, at a designated time, and report, what did you do, what did you miss, and what is tomorrow's commitment. This is not a motivational conversation. It is a brief, factual reckoning. The accountability partner at this level ideally understands the protocol and can ask the right questions. Was the morning anchor the first thing? Was the phone away? What was the hard thing today? The quality of the accountability relationship matters here more than at Level 2 because you're operating in a more demanding system. Practice 5. Non-negotiable bedtime. Every night, the same time. Not approximately the same time. Not the same time except on weekends, or except when there's something good on, or except when you're in the middle of something. The same time, every night, for 30 days. Sleep is not an optional support system for discipline. It is the foundation of it. Research on sleep deprivation and self-control is unambiguous. Even moderate sleep restriction, losing 90 minutes of sleep per night over a week, produces measurable impairment in executive function, impulse control, and emotional regulation. But consistent bedtime is not a lifestyle preference. It is a discipline architecture decision, as structurally important as any other rule in this protocol. Practice 6. 20 minutes of movement every day. Every day. Not most days, not when I have time, not on days when I go to the gym. Every day, for at least 20 minutes, your body moves in a way that elevates your heart rate or engages your musculature meaningfully. Walk, run, lift, yoga, swim, cycle. The specific modality is flexible. The daily non-negotiability is not. Movement is both a discipline habit in itself and a neurological support for all other discipline habits. Research on exercise and executive function, including work by John Rady at Harvard Medical School, consistently shows that aerobic exercise supports prefrontal cortex function, reduces anxiety and depression symptoms, and improves the emotional regulation that self-control depends on. The 20-minute minimum is not about physical fitness, though that will improve. It is about giving your brain the daily neurochemical environment in which discipline is most possible. Practice 7, Weekly Review 1 full hour every Sunday. At Level 2, the weekly review was 15 minutes. At Level 3, it is 1 full hour, and it is comprehensive. You review your tracking record across all 8 practices. You score yourself honestly on each one, not to punish yourself for gaps, but to see the pattern clearly. You identify the 2 or 3 specific points in the week where the system came under most pressure, and you ask, what would have helped here? What design change might have prevented this gap? You also read your identity journal entries from the week. This is not embarrassing. It is important. The entries trace the arc of your identity narrative across the week, where the story was strong, where it was shaky, where you need to deliberately rebuild it. The full hour is not comfortable. Honest review rarely is. Do it anyway. Practice 8, Monthly Renewal, revisit your why and adjust the system. On the final day of the 30-day protocol, you conduct a complete system review. This is not a celebration, though celebration has a place. This is a full audit: what worked, what didn't, what you would change if you were beginning again with what you now know. And centrally, you revisit the reason you started. Not the surface reason, I want to be more productive, but the reason beneath the reason. What changes in your life, specifically, if you become the person this system is building? Who benefits? What becomes possible? This question, revisited after 30 days of work, tends to land differently than it did at the beginning. The distance between who you were on day 1 and who you are on day 30 is real, and that reality gives the question a different weight. The 4-week structure: Week 1, Withdrawal. The first week of the 30-day overhaul feels like withdrawal because it is withdrawal. You are stripping away the comfortable defaults that have been organizing your days. The morning phone. The sleeping in. The productive feeling busy work that avoids the hard thing. The irregular bedtime that allows the evening to drift. These things don't disappear without resistance. Expect the first week to be the hardest. The identity journal entries in week 1 will often be thin, there's not much evidence yet, and the new identity feels more like aspiration than reality. Write them anyway. You are beginning to build the record that week 4 will look back on. Week 2, Fog lifting. Around day 10 or 11, something usually shifts. The new patterns have been repeated enough times that they're beginning to feel less strange and slightly more like your actual life. The identity journal entries start to have more to work with: specific things you did, specific resistances you moved through. The accountability check-ins feel less performative and more real. Week 2 is when the no-phone morning begins to reveal what it was protecting. With the phone out of the morning, you may notice, perhaps for the first time in a while, what your unmediated morning self actually thinks about, values, and wants to do. This is data. It belongs in the journal. Week 3, Rebuild. By week 3, you are stacking. The 8 practices are beginning to feel less like a list and more like an architecture. The morning anchor follows the identity journal, follows the hard thing first, follows the phone boundary, and the whole sequence begins to flow as a coherent unit rather than a series of separate decisions. This is the beginning of genuine automaticity, not complete, but present. Week 3 is also when an identity shift begins to become palpable. Not in a dramatic way, you're not a different person. But there is a growing quality of self-trust, a quiet accumulation of evidence that you are, in fact, someone who does the hard thing, who keeps the commitments, who shows up for themselves consistently. This is the story you've been building since day 1. In week 3, you begin to actually believe it. Week 4, New architecture. By day 22 or so, something interesting happens. The behaviors you've been effortfully maintaining begin to require less effort. Not none, but less. The morning sequence starts to pull you through it rather than requiring you to push. The no-phone rule stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like protection. The identity narrative has enough evidence behind it that it's starting to function as a genuine self-concept rather than an aspiration. Week 4's work is protective. You are defending what you've built from the familiar patterns that will, inevitably, attempt to reassert themselves. The novelty of the protocol is completely gone. The accountability check-ins feel routine. The temptation to ease the structure just a little will be real. Don't.
Week 4 is not the time to relax. It is the time to complete the foundation. Relaxation comes after.
Emergency protocol, the 1% rule for days when everything falls apart. The flight was cancelled, the family emergency happened, the work crisis consumed the day. The correct response is not to abandon the protocol.
The 1% rule: do 1% of every non-negotiable. Not nothing, not everything. 1%. The identity journal entry is 1 sentence instead of 5 minutes. The movement is 5 minutes of stretching rather than 20. The morning hard thing gets 5 minutes instead of the full session. The accountability check-in is a 1-line text.
The 1% rule preserves the identity narrative on the worst days.
You did not do the full protocol.
But you did something, for every non-negotiable, even on the day when doing anything at all was the hardest possible thing. That day, the day you did 1% when you could have done nothing, may be the day that matters most to your developing self-trust. Social and work navigation. 30 days is long enough that it will intersect with social obligations, work demands, and life irregularities in ways that require explicit management. Here are specific approaches for the most common conflicts. When social events run late and threaten the bedtime is non-negotiable. Leave events earlier than you want to, more nights than feels comfortable.
Explain briefly if necessary. I have a morning commitment is sufficient and true without making it into a lecture about the protocol.
Protecting the bedtime is protecting the next day's discipline, which is protecting the whole system. When travel disrupts the environment, prepare the travel environment the way you prepare your home environment.
Phone charger in a different room. Morning anchor materials, notebook, reading, whatever the task requires, in the carry-on. The accountability check-in via text or voice note rather than in person.
The movement is a walk in the airport or a hotel gym session. The system compresses, it does not disappear. When colleagues expect immediate responsiveness, the no-phone morning is not a social contract, it is a personal discipline rule.
You are not obligated to explain it to colleagues.
Most colleagues, in practice, are fine with a 2-hour response delay if you're otherwise reliable. If your role genuinely requires immediate morning responsiveness, define a precise window, 7 to 8 a.m., for example, for checking urgent messages, and defend the rest of the morning as clearly as possible. What to expect? This is uncomfortable.
Not in a heroic, satisfying way, in a grinding, occasionally tedious, occasionally discouraging way.
The discomfort of day 10 through day 12 is particularly well documented in people who undertake sustained habit change programs. By this point, the novelty is completely gone, the results are not yet visible, the structure feels burdensome, and the question, is this actually worth it, will appear in earnest.
It is worth it. But you cannot know that from inside day 11. You have to trust the design and get to day 20.
The fog lifts around day 17 through day 20 for most people. Not for everyone, and not all at once, but somewhere in the third week, there is a shift in how the practices feel. They stop feeling like things being done to you and start feeling like things you're doing.
Agency becomes palpable. The system starts to feel like yours. By day 28, the new you doesn't feel like a costume anymore.
It doesn't feel completely natural yet either. 30 days is not enough to fully complete the identity shift.
But it no longer feels foreign.
The behaviors you've been practicing have begun to feel like expressions of who you are rather than performances of who you're trying to be.
That's the difference. That's what 30 days can actually produce. Protect it. The work in Chapter 10 is what you do next.
Chapter 10, Sustaining the Discipline. In the years after Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile in May 1954, something strange happened. Within 6 weeks, his record had already been broken by Australian runner John Landy. Within 2 years, 3 runners had broken it in a single race. The barrier that had stood for decades collapsed almost immediately after Bannister proved it could be collapsed, and then went on being broken steadily. What changed was not athletic training. The training methods available to runners in 1954 were not significantly different from what they'd been in 1950. What changed was the story, the existence of proof that the thing was possible. Once Bannister had demonstrated that it could be done, other runners' internal narratives about what was achievable adjusted, and with them, their performance.
You have just done your version of this.
Whether you've completed the 7-day reset, the 21-day system, or the 30-day overhaul, you now have proof that you can do this. The barrier you may have been treating as a fixed limit of your personality has been crossed. What remains is not maintaining the heroic effort of the crossing, that was the hard part, but building the architecture that makes the behavior permanent. This is what Chapter 10 is for. The green-yellow-red zone framework discipline systems don't fail all at once. They erode gradually, in predictable stages, and the erosion is almost always preceded by recognizable early warning signs. The green-yellow-red framework gives you a real-time assessment tool for where your system is on any given day or week, and a clear protocol for each zone. Green zone: all non-negotiable behaviors are being completed. Energy levels are consistent with the pattern established during your reset protocol. Consistency across the past week is above 80% on tracked behaviors. The identity narrative feels stable. When you describe yourself internally, the story is one of someone who does the things, not someone who is trying to. In the green zone, the work is maintenance: keep the tracking active, keep the weekly review in the calendar, keep the accountability relationship alive. The temptation in the green zone is complacency, to let the tracking slide because things are going well, to skip the weekly review because there's nothing troubling to review. Don't. The tracking and review are not crisis interventions. They are what create the awareness that prevents crises. Yellow Zone: 1 non-negotiable has been missed or has been happening inconsistently for more than 2 consecutive days. There is drift visible in the pattern, a gradual, slightly hard to name loosening of the system's edges. The accountability check-ins have become perfunctory rather than genuine. Some early warning signs are appearing. You're waking up and checking the phone before the morning anchor, the evening anchor has been abbreviated more than once, the identity journal entries have become thin or absent. In the yellow zone, the protocol is explicit: name what's drifting. Write it down, specifically, in 1 or 2 sentences. Do not wait for a more comprehensive review. Name it now. Then ask, what is the single most important thing to tighten? Not everything, one thing. Return to that one thing with specific, deliberate attention for 3 days and assess whether the drift has stabilized. The yellow zone is where most sustained discipline failures begin, and where almost all of them could be caught if the system included honest self-monitoring. The people who sustain discipline over years are not the ones who never enter the yellow zone. They are the ones who notice it early and respond before it becomes red. Red zone: consecutive misses of 2 or more days across multiple non-negotiable behaviors. The avoidance pattern from before the reset is visibly reasserting itself. You are making excuses that sound familiar, they are the same excuses you made before you started. The accountability relationship has gone quiet. The tracking table has gaps. The identity narrative has shifted from someone who does the things back towards someone who is struggling. In the red zone, the protocol is not willpower. It is structural intervention. Return to the most basic version of the system: 1 non-negotiable, first thing, tracked daily. Restart the accountability relationship with honesty: I've been off the system for a week. I'm starting again today. Here is what I'll do today. No extended self-recrimination. No waiting for conditions to improve before restarting. Return now. The red zone is recoverable. It is not evidence of permanent failure. It is evidence that the system needs a reset, a smaller scale version of what you've already done. The fact that you've done it before is not an irrelevant detail. It is the most important fact available to you. You have already proven you can build this. You are not starting from zero. You are restarting from experience. The 4-stage relapse pattern: understanding how discipline collapses at the process level, not just the fact of it, but the specific sequence, gives you the ability to intervene at earlier stages. Stage 1: rationalization. A single missed non-negotiable is rationalized as acceptable and isolated. 1 missed day is fine, I was genuinely exhausted. This is sometimes true and not inherently problematic. But rationalization becomes a problem when the reasoning extends beyond the specific instance: I've been working really hard, I deserve some flexibility, or the system is too rigid, real life doesn't work this way. These thoughts signal the beginning of the erosion, not its completion. Notice them. Write them down.
Ask whether they're accurate or protective. Stage 2. Drift. The gap between stated commitment and actual behavior widens gradually.
The morning anchor shifts from first thing to later in the morning, then to when I get a chance, then to not at all.
The evening anchor becomes every other day. The weekly review gets skipped this 1 week.
Each individual adjustment feels reasonable, the collective adjustment is a return to the pre-reset pattern. By the time the drift is clearly visible, it has usually been accumulating for a week or more. Stage 3. Justification. At this stage, the rationalizations of Stage 1 have become a settled narrative. I'm too busy right now, this isn't the right season for a disciplined routine, I've made progress and I can be a bit flexible.
The justification narrative is more elaborate than Stage 1 rationalization because more deviation needs to be explained.
The person in Stage 3 is not lying to themselves, they genuinely believe the justifications are accurate assessments of reality.
This is what makes Stage 3 difficult to exit without external input. Stage 4. Collapse. The old pattern has fully returned. The tracking is gone, the accountability is gone, the non-negotiables are gone.
The person may not notice the collapse as a single event, it tends to become visible only in retrospect, when they realize several weeks have passed without any of the system's practices in place. The gap between who they were becoming and who they are feels large, and the sense of having to start over is discouraging. The critical intervention across all 4 stages is the same: honest awareness, specific naming of what's happening, and immediate return to the most basic version of the system. The further along the stages you've traveled before intervening, the more basic the return needs to be.
But the intervention is available at every stage, including Stage 4. The fact of collapse is not evidence of permanent incapacity. It is a signal for a reset.
The 333 monthly check once per month, spend 20 minutes with 9 questions divided into 3 categories.
Write the answers down. Completions. 3 questions about what's working. What are my top 3 consistent wins from this month, the behaviors I've been most reliable about? What has been the most effective part of my current system?
Where have I noticed the clearest evidence of the identity shift?
Moments when I behaved as my new self rather than my old self?
Gaps. 3 questions about what isn't working. What are my 3 biggest failure patterns from this month, the specific behaviors or moments where the system most commonly broke?
At what time of day or week is my discipline most consistently absent? What is the story I tell myself when I skip or avoid? What does that story reveal about the fear or discomfort driving the avoidance? Design. 3 questions about how to improve the system. What 3 changes to my environment, schedule, or accountability structure would most improve next month's consistency? What behavior has been taking the most willpower to maintain, and what design change might automate it further? What should I eliminate from the system because it's creating friction without producing value? The 333 review is not a self-improvement session in the general sense. It is a systems audit.
You are the engineer of your own discipline architecture, and once per month you look at the machine, identify what's working and what isn't, and make specific adjustments.
This is the ongoing work of sustained discipline.
Trigger seasons. Certain periods of the year in life create predictable conditions under which discipline systems are most likely to come under stress. Being aware of these in advance and having specific protocols ready is considerably more effective than dealing with them as surprises. Holidays and extended family time, the physical environment changes, the schedule becomes irregular, and the social context provides strong pull toward the norms of the group you're embedded with. The protocol: before the holiday period begins, identify the non-negotiables that will hold and those that will flex. Announce them to your accountability partner. Allow the flex with explicit awareness. This week my movement non-negotiable is 20 minutes per day, my other practices are on hold, rather than allowing the entire system to dissolve. High-stress work periods, deadlines, launches, major projects, or organizational crises create a context in which the discipline system tends to be framed as an additional burden rather than a support structure. It is, in fact, a support structure. The non-negotiables that maintain sleep, movement, and the morning anchor are protecting the very cognitive and emotional resources that the stressful period demands.
The protocol: simplify rather than eliminate. 1 non-negotiable, non-negotiably, held through the period. The rest can flex.
Relationship changes, breakups, new relationships, major shifts in partnership dynamics, family illness, loss, these create emotional and logistical disruptions that are real and that deserve genuine accommodation. The protocol, the 1% rule from Chapter 9. On the worst days, something happens for every non-negotiable. Even a symbolic amount. The discipline system is not a countersignal to the emotions of the period, it is a structure that prevents the emotions from removing all structure. Travel, covered briefly in Chapter 9, but worth expanding here. The most effective travel protocol is a designated minimum, the smallest version of each non-negotiable that is executable in any hotel room, airport lounge, or unfamiliar environment. This version is decided in advance, before traveling, so that the in-travel decision is simply execute the travel protocol rather than figure out how to maintain the system in this new context. Environmental design for the long-term sustained discipline is not primarily a matter of continued effort. It is primarily a matter of sustained environmental design, ongoing attention to the physical, digital, and social conditions that make the discipline choice easy. Physical environment, your space should make the hard thing easy and the tempting thing harder. The workout equipment should be visible and accessible. The book should be on the table, not on a shelf. The junk food should require an extra step to obtain. The workspace should be associated with work, not with entertainment, not with browsing, not with the full range of leisure behaviors that make it difficult for the brain to switch into work mode. These are not dramatic changes. They are small, deliberate adjustments that accumulate into a physical environment that supports your intentions. Digital environment, 3 principles: remove what you can, restrict what you can't remove, and replace what you restrict. Remove social media apps from your phone if you check them compulsively, not from your life, from your phone. You can still access them from a browser, which creates just enough friction to interrupt the automatic reaching behavior. Restrict notifications to a small number of genuinely important channels. Replace the scrolling habits you've eliminated with something that competes effectively for the same time: a podcast, a book, a language learning app. The digital environment is the most commonly neglected dimension of discipline architecture, and in the current attention economy, it is one of the most important. Social environment. The research on peer influence and behavior is consistent and substantial. The people you spend the most time with have a measurable effect on your behavior patterns, not through explicit instruction, but through the ambient normalization of their own behaviors. If your closest social circle normalizes distraction, inconsistency, and avoidance, you will need to work against that normalization every day. If your social circle normalizes discipline, the normalization works for you. This doesn't mean replacing your friends with productive strangers. It means being deliberate about adding relationships, accountability partners, professional communities, reading groups, fitness communities in which disciplined behavior is the norm. The quiet seasons. One aspect of long-term sustainment that doesn't receive enough attention is what to do during what you might call the quiet seasons, the periods when life is going reasonably well, when the system is running smoothly, when there are no crises or triggers and the non-negotiables are happening without drama. These periods can feel like vacation from the work of discipline, and the temptation is to relax the tracking, skip the reviews, ease the accountability, because things are fine and the structure feels unnecessary. This temptation is worth resisting, not out of anxious vigilance but because of a specific and well-documented pattern. People who maintain their discipline systems during stable periods tend to navigate disrupted periods far more successfully than people who let the systems relax during stability and then try to resurrect them under pressure. The system is most available when it has been continuously maintained. A discipline practice that runs only when things are difficult is not a discipline practice, it is a crisis response, and crisis responses are by definition late interventions. The correct relationship with the quiet seasons is not to work harder or to add new elements for the sake of activity. It is to maintain the minimum viable version of the system, the tracking, the weekly review, the accountability, precisely because you don't need it urgently right now. You are doing maintenance on an asset that will be most valuable to you in exactly the conditions under which you're least likely to be thinking carefully about maintaining it. The annual reset once per year, spend one full day, an actual day, not an evening, doing a complete overhaul of your discipline system. Specifically, review your tracking records for the year. Where were the green periods, the yellow periods, the red periods? What were the conditions around each?
What patterns are visible across the whole year that weren't visible within any individual month? Revisit your 333 monthly check-ins. What patterns appear across the year in the completions, gaps, and design sections? Identify the one non-negotiable behavior that, if you did it consistently for the next 12 months, would have the most significant positive impact on your life. This is your primary anchor for the coming year. Design the system from scratch, using everything you've learned about your own patterns over the preceding year. You know yourself better now than you did when you started. Use that knowledge. What to expect: you will not be perfectly consistent forever. No one is. The question is not whether you will enter yellow zones and occasional red zones, you will. The question is how quickly you catch them, how honestly you name them, and how effectively you return. Over time, what changes is not that discipline becomes effortless. What changes is the recovery time. In the beginning, a week off the system might mean 3 weeks of gradually rebuilding. After a year of practice, a week off the system might mean 2 or 3 days of deliberate return before the momentum is back. After 2 years, it might mean 1 morning of honest assessment and recommitment. The goal is not a flawless record. It is a shorter and shorter recovery time after each slip, a system that gets more resilient with use rather than more fragile, more automatic rather than more effortful, more yours rather than something external being imposed. That is the actual destination. Not perfection. Durability. What to expect: sustainment is quieter than the resets. There are no dramatic starting points, no milestone completions, no specific days to count. There is just the ongoing, mostly unremarkable work of doing the things: the morning sequence, the weekly review, the monthly check, the annual reset, until they have become so embedded in your daily life that not doing them feels stranger than doing them. That day arrives later for some people than others. For a very few people, it arrives within the first year. For most, it takes 2 to 3 years of consistent, honest, iterative engagement with the system. But it arrives. And when it does, you'll barely notice, not because it's not significant, but because it will simply feel like your life, like what you do, like who you are. And that, more than any productivity metric or achievement goal, is what the discipline blueprint was always building toward. Conclusion: the unglamorous victory. Picture this. It's early in the morning, 6:15, maybe 6:30. The light is the pale, non-committal gray of a day not fully decided yet. Someone is at a desk, or in a kitchen, or sitting in a spare room with a single lamp on, and they are doing the thing. Not dramatically. Not with the clean energy of a fresh start or the desperate focus of a deadline. Just doing it, the way they do it every morning, because this is what they do in the morning now. No one is watching. There's no audience. There's no street counter ticking up somewhere that anyone else can see. There's no ceremony around it. They sat down, they opened the work, they began. The work itself is ordinary work: a chapter, a business plan, a creative project, a training session, the kind of work that, viewed from a distance, looks identical to work being done under duress or under inspiration or under any of the other conditions we tend to think of as the causes of work getting done. But the condition here is just Tuesday. The condition is the accumulated weight of many Tuesdays, many mornings, many small decisions over the course of months to begin before it felt completely right, to continue past the point when novelty made continuing feel natural, to return after the breaks that inevitably came, quietly and without drama, because this is what they do. This is the unglamorous victory. This is what it actually looks like, from the inside, when everything this book has described has taken root. There is a particular transformation that happens when you spend a long time, 6 months, a year, 2 years, building and maintaining a serious discipline practice. It's not that the work becomes effortless. It's not that you transcend the human reality of tired days and competing demands in mornings when the couch is genuinely, physically more compelling than the desk. Those things remain. What changes is your relationship with them. At the beginning, when you wanted to build discipline but hadn't yet, every difficult day was a test: would you do it or would you not? The outcome was genuinely uncertain. You might do it. You might not. The question carried real weight because the identity behind it was still being formed. You were, in a deep sense, finding out something about yourself every morning, not performing discipline for some imagined observer, but genuinely discovering, day by day,
What kind of person you were when circumstances stopped being easy. After a while, and the length of a while differs for every person, but it does arrive, the question loses its weight. Not because the behavior has become effortless in any simplistic sense, but because the question of whether you will do the thing has been answered so many times, across so many different conditions, on so many mornings that look like legitimate excuses and turned out not to be, that the answer no longer feels uncertain. You know you'll do it. Not with arrogance, not with the brittle overconfidence of someone who hasn't been tested, but with the quiet certainty of a person who has been tested regularly and has shown up. Who has, as a matter of documented, lived experience, done the hard thing on the days when doing the hard thing was genuinely difficult. This is what self-trust feels like from the inside. It doesn't feel like much, mostly, that's the point. It's not a feeling you walk around consciously experiencing. It's a fact about yourself that you've stopped needing to examine, the way you don't examine whether you trust yourself to remember your own name. The trust is simply present, foundational, load-bearing without calling attention to itself. And its presence, quiet as it is, changes everything about what you're willing to attempt. What becomes possible when you can trust yourself in this way extends far beyond the habits themselves. It is larger, even, than the external results the habits produce, the fitness, the finished project, the cleaner finances, the steadier relationships, the compounding professional progress. Those results matter enormously, and they are real, and they deserve to be fully acknowledged. But they are the visible evidence of something more significant, a fundamentally different relationship with your own agency. People who cannot trust themselves to follow through on their intentions live with a particular kind of ambient uncertainty. They know, somewhere beneath the surface of daily activity, that their intentions are provisional, that what they say they'll do is conditional on future circumstances remaining favorable, on motivation arriving when called, on the day cooperating in ways it cannot be counted on to cooperate. This uncertainty has a gravitational pull that affects everything, including things that appear to have nothing to do with discipline. It affects the ambitions you allow yourself to form. It affects the commitments you're willing to make to other people. It affects the version of yourself you dare to imagine becoming, because if you're not sure you'll follow through, you unconsciously cap your aspirations at a level that doesn't require too much from you. You hedge. You add escape clauses. You stay slightly small. When you can trust yourself, genuinely, on the basis of accumulated evidence rather than renewed hope, the hedging relaxes. You can form intentions and mean them fully, without the internal asterisk. You can make commitments to other people knowing, not as a wish but as a reliable prediction, that you'll keep them. You can set out towards something ambitious and hold the belief, empirically grounded now rather than merely hopeful, that you will still be working toward it in 6 months, that you will not have quietly abandoned it after the novelty wore off. This is not arrogance. Arrogance is confidence that hasn't been earned through actual testing. What we're describing is something different. The specific, grounded, evidence-based confidence of someone who has been tested repeatedly and has shown up repeatedly, whose track record with themselves is good enough that they no longer need to treat every commitment as an open question. That person is different from who they were at the beginning of this book. Not in personality, not in some essential character that has been reformed, but in what they're able to commit to and follow through on, which is to say, in what they're able to build with their actual life. There is a distinction that matters here, and it's worth naming carefully before we close, because it captures the real shift this book has been working toward. It's the distinction between having a plan and having a practice. A plan is something you know about and intend to act on. It exists in the future tense. It is something you're going to do, a structure you're going to implement, a system you're going to start. A plan can be sophisticated, beautifully designed, well-reasoned, and completely accurate in its understanding of what's required. Plans are not the problem. Most people who struggle with discipline have excellent plans. They have morning routines mapped out in meticulous detail, workout schedules that are genuinely well-designed, project timelines that are realistic and thoughtful. The plans are often quite good. The plans are not what's missing. A practice is different. A practice is something you do. It exists in the present tense, not the future tense. It is something that is already happening, that has been happening for long enough to have a shape and a rhythm and a texture that belongs to your actual life rather than to a projected future version of it. A practice doesn't require the same ongoing motivation that a plan requires. because a practice is not waiting for conditions to be right before it becomes real. It is already real. It has been real for months. Its realness is the most recent fact in an established pattern rather than the ambitious first fact in an attempted one. The entire project of this book has been the project of helping you cross from plan to practice. Not through inspiration. There is plenty of inspiration in the world, and inspiration alone has not solved this problem for you or for the vast majority of people who try to build discipline. Through design. Through honest diagnosis of the specific pattern that is yours rather than a generic prescription that may or may not address the particular way your system tends to fail. Through tiered protocols calibrated to where you actually are rather than where you'd like to be, because the right level matters enormously, and the wrong level, however impressive it sounds, produces the same failed result as no level at all. Through the small, repeatable, unglamorous daily work of doing what you said you'd do until the doing becomes the practice. There is something worth saying about the long game here, about what happens not at day 7 or day 30 or even year 1, but over the course of a life in which you have established, maintained, and repeatedly rebuilt when necessary, a genuine practice of doing the things that matter. The research on self-regulation and well-being over the lifespan is interesting on this point. Studies that have followed people across decades find that self-regulatory capacity, the ability to align behavior with intention, to do what you mean to do with reasonable consistency, is one of the most robust predictors not just of professional achievement or health outcomes, but of subjective well-being, of reported life satisfaction, of the degree to which people feel that their lives are expressions of their actual values rather than accidents of circumstance. People who can reliably act on their intentions feel, broadly, better about their lives. Not because they've achieved more, though they often have, but because the relationship between what they value and what they do is closer, tighter, less frustrated. The misalignment that creates so much low-level suffering has been reduced. This is not a guarantee, and it is not a claim that discipline produces happiness in any simple or direct way. The relationship is more subtle than that. What discipline produces is agency, the genuine, evidence-based sense that you have meaningful influence over the direction of your own life, that the choices you make actually determine outcomes rather than being constantly overridden by impulses and avoidances you can't control. Agency is not the same as happiness. But it is one of the things that makes happiness possible in a sustained way, rather than as an intermittent condition that depends on external circumstances cooperating. The research on behavior change and identity is clear on one point that is easy to miss in the day-to-day texture of building habits. Who you are is largely a story you tell yourself based on what you repeatedly do. This is not a philosophical claim. It is a neurological and psychological one, grounded in decades of work on identity formation, self-concept, and self-efficacy. The story isn't fixed. It isn't determined by your history or your temperament or what you failed at in the past. It is updated, continuously, by the evidence of what you do now. Every morning you do the thing, especially the mornings when doing the thing was genuinely difficult, you add a sentence to the story. Not a dramatic sentence, not a highlight reel moment, just a quiet, true sentence: I did it. I said I would and I did. Over weeks and months and years, these sentences accumulate into something that begins to function as a stable foundation rather than a shifting hope. You become, in your own internal accounting, someone who does the things. And that identity stable, evidence-based, quietly available to you in every moment of decision is the most powerful discipline tool that exists. You cannot build it quickly. You cannot borrow it or imagine your way into it or acquire it through any means except the repeated, ordinary experience of doing what you said you'd do. But you can build it. It is available to every person who is willing to begin, not perfectly, not all at once, not from some idealized starting position, but from wherever they actually are, with whatever they actually have, on whatever day it actually is. The person at the desk in the early morning light, doing the ordinary work in the ordinary way on an ordinary Tuesday, they are not more talented than you. They are not more naturally disciplined, not born with some constitutional advantage in the domain of self-control, not possessed of a character type that comes pre-equipped with the habits you're working to build. What they have is a practice, built incrementally from exactly the kind of understanding you now carry, and maintained through exactly the kind of systems you've now been given. They had a starting point once, and it was humble, and they built from it. The morning practice. The kept promise. The word made good. The ordinary, private, unwitnessed act of being true to what you said you'd do, not because anyone is watching, not because the motivation is particularly high this morning, not because the conditions are especially well suited for it today, but because this is who you've decided to become and you've done the consistent work to make the decision real. There are people in your life who will benefit from this in ways they may never fully articulate, people who will experience you as more present, more reliable, more fully the person you've been trying to be. There are goals that will move, work that will get done, capabilities that will develop, a relationship with your own time and energy that will become less fraught and more honest. These are real and they matter. But there is also something that happens at the level of simple private experience, the experience of sitting with yourself at the end of an ordinary day and knowing, without needing to perform the knowing for anyone, that you did the things. That the morning was used. That the commitment was kept. That you were, today, the person you're working to become. That quiet, private, unglamorous experience, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely yours, is the unglamorous victory. It is available to you. It begins with the next thing you do after this sentence ends. Go do the thing.